138 is what?
I'm sorry, 139 will be the TBD phone.
We already have 123 is the TPD phone.
Oh, it's 123? That's the physical phone, Your Honor. I'm sorry, these are the records.
Okay. And then what was the next one after that?
We're going to do this as, I think there's some confusion. We'll do 141 as to the Tallahassee Police Department test phone data.
Well, what is 138 then?
I was told that was the second interview.
Madam Clerk.
138 is the CD for the defendant's interview from November 30th.
Okay. And what is 139? What's that?
He hasn't said it 139.
Okay, I missed it. Then we'll do 139 is going to be the cell phone records for Tallahassee Police Department.
And did you have one after that?
Yes, sir. 140 is the cell bright of Mr. Segura's 509 phone.
So I think 139 and 140 are the new ones. Right?
Yes,
Clerk, the rest have been admitted. I know the defense is subjected to the test. Any additional objection, Mr. Prince?
No, Your Honor.
139 and 140 will be admitted. Okay, ready for jury?
Yes, Your Honor.
Your Honor, I have a small packet of additional cases for the court review.
Okay.
This afternoon, I've already provided the statement approach.
You may. All right, let's have a jury, please.
Mark, we're going to recall until we're jury in the courtroom.
Everybody be seated. Anybody been exposed to anything they should not have been exposed to that we need to discuss? All right. We're recalling Mr. Investigator Lewis. You remain under oath.
Yes, Your Honor.
Investigator Lewis, a name has come up during the course of examination of Jeremy Smith. Did you have contact with Jeremy Smith?
Yes, I did.
And Mr. Smith, who is he as it relates to this particular case?
A boyfriend of Miss Peters.
Did you look into Mr. Smith at all, given his DNA was found on scene?
Yes.
Anything that, any other evidence that would implicate him in this particular crime?
None whatsoever.
No further questions for Mr. Smith?
Any cross?
No, Your Honor.
All right, you can step down.
All right, this time, State will call Investigator Chris Corbett.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
May I proceed?
Thank you. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jurors?
Certainly. My name is Christopher Corbett, and that's C-O-R-B-I-T-T, and I'm a sergeant with the City of Tallahassee Police Department.
He's there at the City of Tallahassee Police Department.
I currently supervise the Technical Operations Unit, and that is the unit within the agency that's responsible for all the sort of high-tech or technological ways that we gather or analyze evidence to support criminal investigations. And it may be things like computer forensics, audio-video monitoring, video collection, those kind of things. And then what I spend most of my time doing, which is the analysis of communication records or phone records.
Okay. In order to do this analysis of, as we're talking about today, cellular phone data and analysis, do you have any specialized training and experience that allows you to do that?
I do. I have well over 1,000 hours of just general technical training, and then 600, getting close to 700 hours of training specific to cell phones and how cell phones operate, understanding communication records that we get from the carriers, and then how to plot those or represent those for presentations.
Okay. And have you ever previously testified as it relates to your analysis and doing analysis of cell phone data, information that's obtained as well as the analysis?
Yes, I have, on numerous occasions.
Approximately how many times are you talking about?
44 or 45 now.
At some point, did you become, Your Honor, at this time I attended the witness.
Any board hire as to his qualifications?
No, Your Honor.
All right, you can proceed.
At some point, did you become involved in the homicide or victims of Brandy Peters, Tamaya and Tanaya Peters, and Javante Segura?
Yes, I did.
How is it that you get involved in a situation like that?
Well, any criminal investigation that may involve communication devices or phones, as far as trying to locate phones or locate people or identify people, they will contact my unit. And so when this incident happened, I was contacted to see what assistance I may be able to offer the case.
Okay. And 126, have you had an opportunity to review of the data for Ms. Peters?
Yes, I have.
They were the information that was provided to you by the cellular company?
Yes, I am.
And which cellular company was that provided for?
Sprint.
Okay. Were you also provided information from a phone number for Henry Segura, 509-4380?
Yes, I was.
Okay. And who, did you have an opportunity to review those?
I did.
And were those the information that you obtained from the cellular company?
They are.
And which company was that?
Verizon Wireless.
Okay. And that states exhibit number 136. And 137 is, were you also provided information as it relates to a secondary or an alternate phone for Mr. Segura, the 408-8669?
Yes, I was.
Did you review those documents?
I did.
And were those the documents that were provided to you from the cellular company?
They were.
And which company are we talking about there?
Again, Verizon Wireless.
Now, as it relates to the analysis of the cell phone, the data you get, how do you go about doing that?
Well, of course, the first thing we do is we actually look at the records, and the various records from the different providers can give us a lot of different information. And we can look at things such as who's calling who, what date, what time, for how long. We can also get location information. We know the cell sites that a handset's communicating with, and some other general information. Sometimes we can get content of communications, text messages. So we want to look at all of those things from the various sets of records, and however it applies to the case, whatever's applicable. If we need to know where someone was, then we look at that location data and we try to plot that on a map. If we just need to know who someone was talking to most frequently, then we'll analyze the records and run a frequency report and say, well, this is the person they were communicating with most often. So whatever it is that's applicable, we take those records, we analyze them, and we provide that information to the case agents.
Is it fair to say that the information that you get from the cellular provider is voluminous at best?
At best, yes.
Okay, lots of different columns and things along those lines.
That is correct.
Did you prepare any kind of visual aids to help in your testimony as it relates to the analysis of these cell phones and would also help the jurors understand your analysis?
I did.
Okay, and would that so help you?
I believe it would, yes.
Okay. Your Honor, permission to use the visual aid?
You mind?
Thank you. Okay. Now you talk about the analysis of the cell phone. What are we looking at here on this first display?
It's just a cover page here, sort of depicting the background images, cell sites as they are here in Tallahassee. We'll cover those more in detail as we get a little further in.
Okay. So how is it that you go about doing this analysis?
Well, the first thing that we got to look at is the kind of information that we can get. Two of the carriers that we've talked about is Verizon Wireless and Sprint. So from Verizon Wireless, they're able to provide us really 4 different types of information. And that is what we call a call detail records report, which has the incoming, outgoing phone calls, dates and times and things like that. They have a text message report, which tells us the text messages that are being sent back and forth. And from Verizon, that's a separate report. We have a content report where they actually can send us what was actually sent in a text message back and forth. Sometimes we're able to get that. And then the fourth report that we get from Verizon is called an RTT report or a distancing report. And it's much more like an engineering type of report. It has some very, very detailed information about the network and the handsets and what's going on. So the first thing we do is we look at those four types of information that we can get from Verizon.
Let me ask you a question real quick as it relates to the text message detail that you're talking about here. Does this give you content of the text message or just information as it relates to who sent it, who received it, things like that?
So the text message detail report that we can get on a regular basis does not have the content in it. It just says this phone number sent a text message to this phone number, this date, and this time. The content is a separate report, and we're not always able to get that, but it is separate.
Okay. And I assume we're going to talk about that a little bit later.
We are, yes.
Okay. All right. So what are we looking at here? These are just basically what the raw data looks like?
That's it. Just an overview of the four types of reports that we're able to get from Verizon, and we'll talk about each one of those specifically as we go through.
Okay.
So this is the call detail records report. This is exactly how it comes to us, and you can see as we talked earlier, there are a number of columns and a lot of different information that comes across. That's sort of what it looks like in the raw. The good thing is Verizon sends us a key. They send us some information to help us decode this, to tell us what those columns mean and what that information represents. So by using that guide that they send us and our training, then we're able to take a look at those records and sort of deduce the information that we need.
You've gone pretty quick here. I assume we're going to slow down and kind of explain this a little bit more.
We are, yes. We'll talk about each section, each column, which is simply our target number. So when we look here, this tells us that these records we're looking at are for phone number 850-509-4380. Again, this is just our target number, tells us who the records are actually for.
Now, when you say target number, you're not talking, I mean, you're talking about that's the number that the target of the information, not necessarily target of an investigation or something like that.
That is correct. The carriers refer to it as the target number. That is the number that we're inquiring about, the number we're talking about. That is the target of the records. Doesn't mean they're the target of investigation.
Okay. All right. So what's next?
So the last that we have here, the last three columns, this is our called and calling numbers and the duration. So here we can see which number was the calling number, the one actually doing the calling, and which one was being called. So this is another way that we could deduce incoming or outgoing just by looking at these. I wouldn't necessarily need that forwarded or originated column, but they help us out with both. And then the last there is that seizure, and that is in seconds, and that is how long the phone call was connected or how long that event lasted. So again, we sort of divide that by 60 seconds to get minutes, and that tells us again approximately how long the phone call was.
Can I ask you a question real quick?
Certainly.
I looked at it, it says called number, and it appears that there's a bunch of them that are from the 509-4380, and the last one appears to be 321-8577. Does that indicate that these first ones are incoming, and that last one is one that was dialed by the 509 number?
Certainly. So the calling party number, again, is the person doing the calling. So we can look at that and say for this first line, 850-644-1371 is doing the calling, and they called number 850-509-4380. So knowing that 509-4380 is our target, we would know that that's an incoming call. And as we keep going down the list, we keep seeing that our calling party continues to be something other than our target number until we get to that last one in the example. So there, the calling party is the 509-4380, and it has dialed the 321-8577. So we know that that would be an outgoing call.
Okay, I think you covered this, but these numbers for the seizure of the length, that's in seconds, correct?
That is in seconds, yes.
Okay. All right, what's next?
So the next report that we get from Verizon would be the text message report that we talked about. It's very, very similar to the call detail records report. You can see that there's a date time column, there's a target number column, and we can see the origination and destination. So that would be our calling party and receiving party again. So we know which phone is texting which phone. The thing to note here is that, again, there is no location information provided with this text message report. We do not see the cell sites or the sectors that a handset was communicating with in this particular report. Then the next thing that we have is the text message content. So again, sometimes we're able to recover the actual content of the messages from the carrier, and the report looks like this. If I can get a little more detailed, we can see that there's some information here at the top left, we can see that there is the message arrival time. And so that tells us that this particular message was at 10:36 p.m. And I got to kill an application here. 10:36 p.m. on 11/11. We can see that there is a originating number, which will be the 570-8339, a terminating number, which will be the 509-4380. So that tells us that this is an incoming to our target. And then we have the actual text message content here, which would be just a voicemail notification in this example.
Okay, what's next?
So next we would see this RTT report that we talked about. This is Verizon's engineering report. It's a very detailed, very lengthy report with a lot of information in it. But the most important thing that we get from this report is not only do we see the cell site and sector, but we also see an approximate distance from the tower that Verizon is reporting to us. So we will see this access distance in miles. So we can see the first one there is 0.15 and then 1.78. So not only do I have the cell site and the sector that it's using, but now I have an approximate distance from the tower. It sort of helps me narrow down that area to some degree. In the RTT report, we also get location information for text messages. So even though I don't have it in the text message report, if I have this distancing report, I do see locations for text messages, and I might also see locations for data events. So the RTT report is an important report for us, particularly if we're trying to identify where a handset might be or where it was or where it's going.
Okay, if I can, real briefly, the RTT data and the distance calculations here, if you can give a very brief overview, how is that calculated? Are you aware of that?
I am. It is a little complicated. The Verizon, or the type of network that it is, the technology that it uses, sort of uses codes to scramble and identify unique subscribers. So there is this long code that is transmitted from the tower, and it's transmitted at a very specific rate, and these little chips of information come out, and we know exactly how fast they're traveling, and we know how often they're sent. So if we know when that piece of information left the tower, and we know when it arrives at the phone, and we know how fast it was going, then simple, time of arrival calculation can say, well, if I went a mile at 60 miles an hour, or, I traveled for 1 hour at 60 miles an hour, then I must be 60 miles away. So it's sort of it's a very simplified explanation for it, but it is that distance of arrival.
Fair to say we're talking about a lot faster rate than 60 miles an hour, but the same kind of calculations?
We are. It actually travels at the speed of light, and very, very quickly, and very, very small units of information, but yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, what's next?
So the next thing, that's all the information that we get from Verizon. The next carrier that we talked about was Sprint. So Sprint provides us with two reports, and that would be our call detail records report, which is very, very similar to Verizon's call detail records report. And then they have what they call their per call measurement or reveal report. And it is, again, sort of similar to Verizon's RTT. So those are the two different reports that we're able to get from Sprint. So here's the Sprint call detail records report. You can see the same type of columns. We have an indication of numbers that are calling, being called, direction, dates and times, duration, and we'll look at those in a little bit more detail here. Thankfully, again, Sprint sends us a key here to help understand the records, so we know what all the columns mean. And then we can look at each of them individually. Again here, calling, called, and dialed digits. This is just like our originating and terminating numbers in the Verizon records. It tells us which phone number is making the call and which phone number is receiving the call. As we go further across, we see that we have this MR, or directionality, and here instead of the MT, MO, we see incoming or outgoing, or routed. If it goes to voicemail, it may be routed. We see not only a start date, but an end date. They give us both. They also give us a duration. This is again in seconds, so we have to divide that by 60 to get to minutes. And one of the things that we see is that text messages will not have a duration. Obviously, they're very, very short. And we're talking about SMS or short message or text messages. They sort of all mean the same thing. But when we send a message to someone across the network, that would be a text message. No duration, and they do not give us locations for text messages in this report. Well, the other thing to note about the text messages is they're delivered to us in central time. All the phone call activity would be in switch time, which would, again, for Sprint would be Jacksonville, the same as Verizon. But the text messages, because where Sprint, the actual office is located, those text messages come in central time. So when we see the report, we got to make an adjustment that, hey, the text message is going to be an hour behind. We got to move it up.
And that's because their offices are located in central time zone?
That's correct.
Okay.
Then the last column we have is the same as we saw with with Verizon. Their repolled is the same thing as a Verizon switch, and instead of naming it, they give it a number. And then we have this first cell and last cell. So that's our beginning and ending cell sites and sector. So just like with Verizon, we know the cell site that a handset was communicating with for a particular event. So going to move on to sort of how we plot these and how they would look and plotted on a map.
Okay. What are we looking at here?
So this would be an example from the Verizon records, and we talked about that cell site and sector as the location information. So we see here that originating is cell site 844, and we have a sector of 3 equals beta. Beta is actually, that tells us that it's side 2 of that tower. So I know that I'm looking for 844, so I go to this rather large cell site key that Verizon sends us, and I can find cell site 844, and it gives me all the information about the different technologies, the orientation of the sectors. So most of our cell sites are actually divided into multiple sectors, and they have antennas that point in different directions. And it's really important for us to know which direction those are pointed, because if I know which side of a cell site a handset is communicating with, that gives me an idea of which side of the tower that handset was on. So if my tower's in the middle and I'm communicating with a cell face that's here, then I know my handset is going to be over here somewhere as opposed to on this side. So that cell site is really important for us to help narrow down the area that a phone could be in. So they give us all that information there, and if we sort of focus that down to the important stuff, it tells us that cell site 844 is located on Putnam Street. That gives me the latitude and longitude of the cell site, and it tells me those 3 sectors and exactly which azimuth or what degree those different sections or sectors are facing.
When you say degree, you're talking about the compass, the 360 degrees of the compass?
That is correct, yes.
Okay.
So if we go to the map, we can see this is Putnam Drive, and if you kind of look close there, we can see that there is actually a cell site there. It's a tower. Yep. And it's actually, we don't call them towers, we generally call them sites because they're not all actually built on towers. A lot of them are on poles. Some of them are attached to sides of buildings or water towers or whatever. So you'll hear me say cell site. So if we take and represent those 3 sectors, and again, we know from the records, we have one sector that should be at 355 degrees, one at 125 degrees, and then another at 245. Then I can put 3 arrows on the map, and those arrows are pointing in the directions that those cell faces point. And it'll get clearer here in a second. So we drop out the background here. It makes it a little bit easier to see. And again, this would be our cell site 844, and that would be the direction that those 3 sectors are facing. They line up with the compass points so that we know that we're accurate in how those are represented on the map. And then as we draw the rest of them around town, we can get an idea of where the various cell sites are located and what direction those sectors are pointing in. So if we're going to represent, if we're going to say it was communicating with Verizon cell site 844 sector 2, well then we will highlight that sector. So here it's a larger blue arrow. So for that one sample event that we're mapping here, this is the cell site and sector that the handset was communicating with.
Okay. Now, I know when we went back, we talked about that compass and different degrees that the cell sites are facing. Is there a hard and fast line, essentially, where it drops from one sector to the next sector?
There is not. The sectors have to overlap, otherwise you would lose coverage as you just drove circles around a cell site. So the sectors have to overlap a little bit. The cell sites themselves overlap a little bit so that we maintain coverage. So there's not a hard and fast line where Sector 1 ends and Sector 2 begins. It's a sort of a fuzzy area. It's not super big, but there is that area that we'd expect the phone could talk to either sector. And as you move further into the main part of that sector or more in front of that orientation, then we'd expect that that is the sector you would talk to because you would no longer be able to see the other sectors. So here, that's just represented by the little dashed lines. When we talk about Sector 2 of this cell site, we would expect it to cover approximately this area. So here out, down here out, but that would be Sector 2. And somewhere along this line right here, if a handset were moving around, we would expect it to transition from Sector 2 up to Sector 1. So one of the other neat things that we talked about was the distancing information that we're able to get. So for this sample event, we're given a distance. And so now, instead of talking about the whole area out here that the handset could have been in, Verizon is telling us that that handset was very close to this distance here. So again, I know that my sector is going to change somewhere right about here and somewhere right about here. So I'm really only looking at this arc that comes around right here. This is the part that I'm looking at. That is where, approximately where I would expect to find my handset for that particular event.
So why are we doing a full circle?
Well, we do a full circle because our mapping program, and we use the same mapping program that is part of the city-county mapping. So it's the same mapping that we use to respond to calls for service and the property appraiser uses. It is sort of the official mapping for our area here. And they have some wonderful features and are able to do a lot of really neat things to help us represent. But right now they don't draw arcs. And so we have a circle that tells us, again, that distance, but we know when we're looking at it that we can exclude this part of the arc because we're talking about this cell site and sector.
Okay. What do we have next?
So one of the things in the RTT report, sometimes we not only see the primary cell site that a handset was using or communicating with for an event, but sometimes the handset is also aware of other cell sites that it can see. And when I say see, I mean communicate with. And if it were to need to transition, if it were moving and I wanted to go from one cell site to another or hand off, then it is aware, well, this cell site's over here and I can see it with such and such quality, and there's a cell site over here that I can see with such and such quality, and one back there. So it's sort of always aware of what options it may have. So sometimes in the report, we're able to get distances from those cell sites as well, the alternate cell sites or active set or whatever we want to call them. But there are other cell sites in the report that are giving us a distance. So if we have those and we can plot those as well, then we start getting arcs. We start getting crossing arcs. And we say, well, you know, 2 circles can only cross in 2 places, 3 should only cross in 1. So those, if we have those other distances, kind of helps us narrow down the area, even on that 120-degree arc where our handset might be. And in this case, we do have some different distances. And so we say if we're approximately this far from this cell site and this far from this cell site, then again, that kind of narrows down the area that we would expect to find our handset in.
Okay. And is that basically how you analyze this data?
That is it. That is how we take it from the raw records, find that cell site, put it on a map, highlight it, draw the lines, and make a determination where a handset may or may not be.
Okay. Now, next we talk about the cellular data that you may have analyzed during the course of this particular trial. The investigation. What are we talking about? What's the first analysis you did that we're talking about?
The first analysis that we looked at was the 17th of November, a couple of days prior to the homicide.
Okay, and whose phone were you looking at as it relates to this? Are we talking about Mr. Segura's phone?
We are, yes.
Okay, both of those 509 as well as the 408 number?
That's correct.
Okay, did you prepare a visual aid as well?
I did.
Okay, can you show it to us?
I will. Take me just 1 second to switch over.
All right. Okay, and we're talking about November 17, 2010.
We are, yes.
So we're talking about 2 days before the homicide, or 2 days before the homicide, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I noticed that you made a distinction here, the 509 with the 408, we're calling it the disclosed and undisclosed phone based on interviews, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. What are we looking at here?
So again, we sort of start these off with just an overview. This is the general area of town that we're looking at, which will be sort of the south or southeast side of Tallahassee. There's a couple of addresses of interest that are marked on the map, and then we see the cell sites. So those are all, as we're both phones are Verizon, those are the Verizon cell sites in that area at the time of the incident, and that's sort of where we start.
Okay, you mentioned addresses of information. 908 South Creek Run, what address is that?
That is the victim's residence.
Okay, and then the 1098 Mustang Drive, what does that address indicate?
That was Mr. Segura's address.
Okay, all right. So the first take a look at it looks like 509-4380?
That is correct.
Okay, what are we looking at here?
We're looking at a period of time in the early afternoon hours of the 17th, and based on the information that I had, Mr. Segura had traveled to Ms. Peters' residence, so we were looking at the events in that time frame to see what the records look like. From his primary or disclosed phone, the 509-4380, we saw that all the events after about 1:03 and up till 3 o'clock were passive, meaning they're incoming events. So all of these 3 phone calls that come in at 1:15, 1:36, 2:27, they're incoming to the phone and they get forwarded to voicemail. They're not actually answered or picked up. We saw that there was an incoming call at 1:36 from Ms. Peters' phone, which was the 590-8171. And then we saw again here all of these are communicating with, as we can see, 850 or 851. So if we look at those on the map, we can see that here's Verizon 850 Sector 2, which is over here. And then we also saw the very last one communicated with a cell site that's over here.
Okay. And then I noticed that it looks like you did some distance calculation as well.
Well, not calculation. I'm just representing the distance that's in the records. So if we plot those on the map, then we can see that this is what Verizon tells us would be the approximate distance from the cell site that handset was for all of those events.
Now I noticed that we're assuming he's at the house because you're getting both in the house in the middle. Why would the 2 arcs there not line up on his house?
Well, we see that on most of the events as we go through this, that the estimated distance is a little bit short of where we actually are. And there's a lot of things that go into that calculation, but we see it rather consistently that the distance portrayed is a little short of where the actual location is.
Okay. And I think the key word there was estimated distance.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. All right, what's next?
So we talked again about possibly having some additional distancing. The other cell sites that the handset may see for an event, those are also very consistent with what we saw for the first. So we would say that it was consistent with that handset being at Mr. Segura's residence during that time frame.
And this is all the 509 phone number that Mr. Segura initially provided to law enforcement, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. Did you also take a look at the 408 number, which is the one that he did not disclose to law enforcement?
That is correct. So here's the excerpt of records for that time frame. As we zoom in a little bit, we can see that not only do we have some forwarded events, but we have some originating events. So we do have some outgoing phone calls that's sort of in that same time frame. So it tells us this handset is being used.
Okay. So that does an indicator. The other phone, if I understood you correctly, was a passive. Everything's kind of incoming, but nobody's actually sending anything out. And meaning nobody's manipulating the keyboards or stuff like that.
From the records, that's what it would appear, yes.
Okay. And then this one indicates someone's actually manipulating the phone in some way.
That's correct.
Okay. What's next?
So we start looking at those events, and we go to our RTT report to get those detailed pieces of information. But our 12:41 p.m. in the afternoon, we have an outgoing voice call that's Verizon 850 Sector 2. And this is the same one we just saw a second ago with the other phone. So we know that it's using the same cell site the other handset was. We were provided distancing information. And if we compare sort of the one phone to the other, the undisclosed phone being represented in red and the disclosed phone being represented in green, we can see that they're reporting sort of very similar distances, same cell site, same sector, and it will be consistent with those phones being together in that late 12, just before 1 p.m. time frame.
Okay, so we're talking about this is a single phone call on the 408 number at 12:41 p.m. on the 17th, 2 days prior to the homicide.
That's correct.
Okay. Did you do another analysis of another
Yes. As we continue looking at the records, we see that this handset begins communicating with different cell sites. So now for a 1:48 p.m. call, about an hour later, we see that it's communicating with now Verizon 847, which is a little further. It's up Woodville Highway here, just inside of Capitol Circle, and we're provided with a distance, the sector in the distance that puts it along this arc right here.
Okay. So we're talking about roughly this area right here is what this is communicating, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And I think this is Tram Road in this area, is that correct?
It is, yes.
Okay. All right, make sure we're in the right area.
Yep, that's
All
Tram
right.
Road right there.
Okay, take a look at another. I see we do additional distancing.
We did. For that event, the handset was able to see some additional towers and report some additional distances. So when we represent those on the map, we sort of get a couple of crossing arcs there. And again, that gives us just a little bit better idea where the handset might have been for that event.
Okay. And I think we heard from, if we can go back just a second. And I think we've heard, or information is that Mr. Segura was over at her house on the 17th. This information, would that be consistent with that at that time?
It would be, yes.
Okay. All right. What's the next call with that?
We had an event a few minutes later, communicating with a different cell site, one a little bit further south, and we're given a distance from that, which is represented here. And then we also have, for this event, some additional distancing. So it's actually being able to see a couple of different cell sites in a few different sectors and reporting those distances.
Okay. What's the next phone call?
So we now have an event 154, and we're communicating with 847, Sector 1, this same cell site that we're going to talk a lot about. And we're given a distance, again, sort of consistent with that first one that we saw, and only one distance for this event.
Why would sometimes we get one and sometimes we get more than one?
It's largely based on the type of event that it is. With the short message service or the text messages, they're a relatively short blip of information, so the handset doesn't really need to know the other.
Now, I noticed that first one that we talked about, I think it was at 141, was it? We were talking to this tower, then we went south and we went back to that tower. Does that indicate that the person has left an area and then come back, or what are we talking about?
It doesn't necessarily indicate that. We know that as we start communicating with cell sites that are further and further south, sort of our error grows a little bit. Obviously, the further away from something, if there's an error factor, it would compound as I get further and further away. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the handset left, but it could have. It could have left that immediate area, made a small move, and then gone back.
Does the topography, meaning the elevation and stuff like that, factor into which towers they may communicate with?
It does, absolutely.
Okay, if someone's on top of a hill, if you will, would that allow them, I guess, to reach out to a farther location than they would if they were in a dip?
Yes, it does.
As it relates to 908 South Creek Run, where is that indication? Is that, if memory serves me, there's kind of a hill that runs through your fall up the road.
There is actually, and that will come into play for a lot of the locations that we look at. Sort of Paul Russell here is the top of a ridge. And as you start down here on Tram Road and work your way through the neighborhood and up Saddle Creek and then start coming up Jim Lee Road, you are actually coming up a hill. And you're coming up to the top, and when you get to the traffic light here, and then you start down the other side in front of Rickards. If you've driven in front of Rickards High School, you know that you're going down a hill there. So this is kind of a ridge. And the further that I travel up this, the higher that I get. And just like with the naked eye, I can see further. My handset can also see further. It can see cell sites that are a little further away. So it might be more inclined to reach out for a cell site that it has now a more direct line of sight to, better able to communicate with. So we see that as the test events or as our mapping locations move up the hill, we start to see different cell sites that it communicates with.
Okay. Move on to the 212.
212, again, our 849, which is that cell site that's a little further south. And we have some additional distancing for that one.
Okay. Now it's interesting. I think this is our first part here for the 849, but with the secondary distance, it's actually moved up a lot closer to the home.
It has, yes.
Okay, so that would tend to indicate maybe the home is still that handset, even though it's communicating, and that first part that is communicating with 849, it's still maybe in that same area.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. All right. Let's look at the 239 phone.
So, yep, we have a 239. It's a outgoing voice call. Again, this cell site, we can see our distance that's reported and some additional distancing here. And again, looking at the averages of these, it remains consistent with the Saddle Creek Run address.
Okay, how about 245?
So 245, we're our same 847, Sector 1, but our distancing has gone a little further now. It's actually got a little past the residence. We look at our additional distancing, they're relatively consistent, and it may be consistent with a location that's a little north or maybe moving just away from that area.
And it kind of looks like that's actually almost on Paul Russell Road.
Certainly Paul Russell Road will be included in where that handset could be, yes.
And that is one of the possible exits from Ms. Peters' home, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. All right, then look at the 246 home.
The next event we see is a 246, an outgoing voice call. We have some distancing and some additional distancing. And now here, a few minutes later, we see that we moved from this area possibly down to this area here.
Okay. And once again, I noticed one of the intersections is there, coming down essentially Crawfordville Highway.
That's correct.
Okay. What's next?
Then we have an event several minutes later, 259. We're now communicating back with our Verizon 850 Sector 2. We see our distancing here as it relates to Mr. Segura's residence, and our additional distancing, all again now being consistent again with that residence.
And that would be, eventually we would go down Crawfordville Highway to get to that location, correct?
That is correct, yes. That would be one of the routes would be to come down Crawfordville Highway and go across Oak Ridge Road.
Did you do a comparison as it relates to the 408 number, which is the undisclosed phone, and the 509 number, which was the disclosed phone?
We did, yes. Okay. And looking at those events in between the 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock kind of time frame, we can see that the disclosed phone, again here in green, is communicating with different cell sites, different sectors, different distances than the undisclosed phone, which is represented in red. It would be consistent with those phones not being together.
Okay. What's next?
So we have the additional distancing, just throwing in the other numbers that we have, and again, represents the same.
All right, so what does this tell you about those two phones? Were they together or separate?
Well, judging by the cell sites and sectors they're communicating with, they do not, it's not consistent for them to be together, to be in the same place. Taking into account the distancing, certainly not. So it would be inconsistent with these phones being together.
Okay. And earlier we saw the overlay where they were both essentially together at the earlier communication in the neighborhood of the 109 Mustang Drive, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. What's the next analysis you did?
The next time that we looked at was actually the 20th of November, which would be the morning after the homicide.
Okay. And it's my understanding at that time, Mr. Segura's his statement of law enforcement that he had gone down to Mr. Thornton's home, correct?
That is correct.
In South County. All right. Can we take a look at that?
We can. Again, it'll take me just a second to transition.
Yes. All right, so it looks like our first look is, again, we have the 1098 Mustang Drive, which was Mr. Segura's home.
Correct.
What is the 560 Natural Bridge Lane?
That was Mr. Thornton's residence at the time.
Okay. It looks like we're going to look at the 509-4380 phone number.
That's correct. And again, we're going to look at both of them together to see if they were traveling together or not, to see if they're consistent with traveling to the location that they reportedly did. So if we look at both sets of the call detail records, we can separate those out for the time frame that we're looking at. And again, that would be that Saturday early morning into Saturday afternoon time frame. And then we can actually kind of put them together here take out all the columns that don't matter a whole lot for us. And we can see that the 408 in red, the 509 in green, they seem to be communicating with sort of similar cell sites. They seem to be, changing cell sites together. They're both communicating with different cell sites than we've seen before. So that's kind of our first look at maybe they're traveling together.
Okay. It looks like the first call or the first event we're going to look at is a 605 phone.
That is correct. So 6:05 a.m. From the undisclosed phone, there's an outgoing call. It communicates with the same Verizon 850 Sector 2 that we've seen before, and we know is consistent with the residents.
Okay. What happened next?
The next event we have is 8:34 a.m. Again, the outgoing call from the undisclosed phone. And now we've communicated with a cell site down here off Bloxham Cutoff. We're looking at this cell site that's sort of facing the southwest. So we would, from the 6:05 event to this event, the handset appears to have moved south and now be somewhere down Crawfordville Highway.
Okay. What's that?
Next we have is at 10:21. So this is from the disclosed phone. We have an event that's now communicating with a cell site here in Panacea. So again, that will be consistent with even further travel south and definitely towards the area that it was reported to have gone.
Okay. And it looked like the first two, you get a green arrow here, and the first two that we looked at had the red arrow. Are we talking about the two different phones?
That's correct. Again, as we look at all of this, the undisclosed phone will be represented in red and the disclosed phone in green, so that we're able to see which of the two handsets we're talking about.
So it appears that at least in this morning, he's using both of those phones.
That is correct.
Okay. What's the next event?
So 10:21, we're now communicating with a cell site here closer to Sopchoppy, and which would be Verizon 858 and Sector 3. 12:11, we now have, as it's read, the undisclosed phone, and that is communicating with Verizon 861, which is down here closer to the coast, and that one sector, which is the one that's facing north. 12:15, we have from the disclosed phone an outgoing phone call, and it is also communicating with that same 861 Sector 1.
All right. I haven't seen any of the distancing stuff. Did you do any distancing analysis here?
We did. Oftentimes, just knowing the cell site and the sector is all that we need to know that it's consistent with travel in this case. So now we have two events that are just a few minutes apart. So we have a 12:11 phone call from one phone, a 12:15 phone call from the other. So now they obviously couldn't have moved too far apart. So we can look at those two events together and see if we can be a little more detailed about whether or not they're actually maybe in the same place. So we can do that with the distancing. Both that 12:11 and the 12:15 event is in the RTT report. And so we can look at our the undisclosed phone, and we get our distancing here, which again, a little short, but pretty consistent with our location, or estimated location. Some additional distancing. So down here, it's a little flatter. We're able to see more cell sites, so we report a number of distances. Those are, again, sort of intersecting there, very consistent with where. We can look at our disclosed phone. We see that we get what appears to be a very similar distance, same cell site, same sector. We have some additional distancing from it. And then we can kind of put them both together. So here's our distancing for those events. Again, the red being the undisclosed, green being the disclosed. You see that they're very similar reported distances. And actually, we can add in the additional distances. We can see that these are pretty consistent with both these handsets being in approximately the same location. Then we have one final thing. It'll take just a second to load here, but oftentimes when we're trying to look at the distancing of two Verizon handsets on the same map at the same time, if they're reporting the same distances, then we're kind of drawing lines on top of lines. So there's another way for us, if we do that, the line on top of line, then we can't see if it's red or green. So we're able to actually do another type of map here where we can sort of superimpose the two together. So again, the red events would be the undisclosed phone, the green events being the disclosed phone. And as we swipe across, we can see that at least a couple of these distances here and here are being reported pretty much identically. But this gives us the ability to kind of look at both of those distances together without worrying about drawing one line right on top of another.
Okay. What was the next analysis that you did?
So the next analysis we did, we started looking at the 19th of November, which is the date of the homicide. We started looking at the victim's phone here, Ms. Peters' phone, and trying to see what events we may be able to learn from that.
Okay. Can we take a look at that, please?
We can, and again, it'll take me just a second to transition.
And I think that we talked earlier that Ms. Peters' information is actually correct, not the license. Is a little bit different?
That is correct.
Okay. What are we looking at here?
So this is just the overview. This is the Sprint call detail records for the 19th for Ms. Peters' phone. We talked about the Sprint records before and the kind of stuff that's in there, the cell sites and the incoming, outgoing dates and times, all that. So what we wanted to look at here was sort of more what kind of activity we had. So we can actually kind of pull out some of the stuff, the location stuff, and kind of look at whether the events are incoming or outgoing and when these events are happening. What we see is that we have, starting here at the top, 5:51 p.m., we have an outgoing phone call, then we see an incoming, an outgoing. These will be text messages here. And then after about this time, just before 7 o'clock, we start seeing that they're incoming, and these 333 would be like a notification, maybe a voicemail notification or something. But we start seeing that everything is now incoming or routed. So we can kind of make a determination about the passive versus active. We talked before about whether someone is actually pushing buttons on the phone and making something happen or not. And that being a little bit of a clue to us whether, the handset is being used or not. So we look at those events and look at them as whether they are active or passive.
Okay. And it looks like, and this is the night of the homicide, this is what we do the night of the homicide, correct?
That is correct.
Right. And if I'm looking at this information, it appears that you have a couple at the top here that are both active and passive events, with the last passive event or active event, being at 6:53 p.m.
That's correct.
Okay. The next one appears to be at 6:50. Actually, it looks like there's two of them at 6:55.
Yes, and these are, again, the notifications. It would be a text message, and with that short code there, it would indicate to us just a notification sent from the carrier to the handset. Most often, that's like voicemail notification.
Okay. And those appear to be a passive event, so indicating she's not doing anything with them, correct?
That is correct.
All right. And then again, we have another one at 7:13.
Correct.
Still passive?
It is passive. The direction tells us that it's routed, and actually we see in front of the number here, we see a 1-1. And if we go to Sprint's records key, it tells us that calls routed straight to voicemail will have a 1-1 before the number. So when we see that 1-1 here with these calls, and these will be text message notifications again, but for all the voice calls, we start seeing the 1-1, 1-1, 1-1, and again, Sprint tells us that means they were routed straight to voicemail.
Okay.
And I don't mean that someone had to push the button to send it to voicemail. I'm saying the network sent the phone straight to voicemail.
Okay, so that's the network doing that, not necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, it can be either one, but for this case, it does not require someone to actually hit ignore, and not take the phone call. The network is going to either try to reach the phone and not be able to do it, or once the phone leaves the network and the network knows that the phone's unreachable, then it'll go straight to voicemail. If you called someone and their phone is on and it rings and rings and rings and it finally goes to voicemail, versus if you call them and immediately goes to voicemail, the network knows the phone's not available.
Okay. So as it appears from this, that starting at 6:53 then, the following 6:53 event, from henceforth, there are no more active communications, meaning nobody was manipulating that phone with the Peter's phone, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and that's from that 6:53 p.m. all the way until the body was discovered?
That is correct. Of things that we look at, the voice calls are important to tell us whether maybe the phone is reachable or not. So we see that there is a voice call here around 6:11. We see that we have a voice call at 7:13, and then the next is 8:21. So I know that we've got at least 3 voice events there in the evening that may help me determine whether the handset's reachable. We do that by going over to that that distancing report or that per call measurement data report that Sprint has. And again, being a network report, it gives us a little better idea of what's actually happening on the network side. We can take out all the things that aren't really relevant to us here. And we see that in this per call report, I do have my voice call just after 6:11, 6:12 right there. I do see that in there. I see the text messages that we saw. I see the 7:14, which will be rounded up from the 7:13. So that one voice call we saw in the records at 7:13, that is in my per call report. So
And this was not one that was inactive, it was a passive one.
that is correct. It is an incoming phone call. Our data sessions here, we do have a little data activity. Does not have to be active. Can be your phone, checking voicemail, Facebook, email, those kind of things. They can be passive events from a phone. But I do see that that 7:13 call was not answered. We saw in the records that it was routed straight to voicemail, but the phone was on the network at that time because it is in our per call report.
So what does that mean? It's on the network.
Well, it means that the phone was in communication with the network. Even though no one answered the phone itself was still seeing the network, and the network reported activity about the phone, approximate location, and other things about the phone for that event. But what I don't see is the 8:21 phone call. So we knew that our next phone call in the report here was at 8:21. So this 8:21 call that is also routed to voicemail is not in the per call report. So at 8:21, when someone tried to reach the phone, the network had no information about where the handset was or what it was doing at that time.
What does that tell you?
It tells me most likely that the phone left the network for whatever reason. Powered down, turned off, ran out of juice, whatever it might be.
Okay.
So again, as this passive data event at 7:49 is the last event that I have, the 8:21 call is not. There's nothing else in the per call report after that. It's consistent with that handset leaving the network in that time frame.
Okay, so as I understand it then, our last active event is at 6:53, and then at 8:21 there is an event that we know the phone is not communicating with the network, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And just for clarification, were you able to do any kind of analysis of the actual phone for Brandy Peters?
No, it was never recovered.
So it was not found on scene?
No, it was not.
Okay. All right. What are we looking at next?
So we were looking to see if there were communications or who she might have been communicating with that day. Obviously, we became aware of Mr. Segura's numbers. So we can take her call records and filter those down to communication events between her and either of Mr. Segura's numbers. We can see that starting in the morning of the 19th around 11:30, 1:18, we have a number of voice calls here. This 219 is a text message, but we have a number of communications between Ms. Peters and the 408, which will be the undisclosed, and we have a text message with the 509, which would be the disclosed.
Yeah, just for clarification, it's 590-8171. That's Ms. Peters' phone number, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So it looks like we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 phone calls or events that are going where Mr. Segura's undisclosed phone, the 408 number, is contacting Ms. Peters' phone.
That's correct.
And some of those are actual conversations that have length to them.
That's correct. The first one is 3,300 seconds.
Okay.
Do the
And
math.
we have an outgoing text from Mrs. Peters' phone to Mr. Segura's main phone, the 509 number.
That is correct.
Okay. And then subsequent to that, we have an incoming call again from the 408 number to Ms. Peters' phone number.
That is correct.
Okay. And let me ask you this. If someone was utilizing a star 67 feature or something like that to block the caller ID, would that show up in this report?
It would not show up in this report because we're looking at our target number here is Ms. Peters' record, so that phone that was doing the star 67 will be incoming, so we wouldn't see it in those records. We would need to go to the person who's doing the calling and look at those records to see what they were actually pushing into the phone.
So if I understand you correctly, then the star 67 feature, if utilized, it obviously blocks the caller ID on the person's phone who's receiving the phone call. but it doesn't necessarily block the information for the network as far as these phone records go.
That's correct. The network, we still had to be able to route the call. So while it doesn't present the caller ID information, the network still has to know the number that is placing the call. So we will see the phone number in there. We just don't know for Sprint, for these records at this time, we don't get any indication whether the caller ID was present or not.
Did you do a comparison between this information that came from Mrs. Peters' Sprint records to anything having to do with Mr. Segura's phone?
Yes. Obviously, if we see the incoming calls in the Sprint records, we would expect to see the outgoing calls in Mr. Segura's Verizon records. So indeed, we look over at those and we can see the same events that we just saw, the 3,300 second event, the other phone calls that went to voicemail, the 100-some second events. We see all of those here. And what we see on the Verizon side is that the called number, or what was actually the number that was communicated with, is preceded by the *67.
And it's just, obviously, we've talked about it, but *67 is the function that would block caller ID.
That is correct.
So Ms. Peters, in receiving these phone calls, would not be able to see the phone number that it was coming from or the person that was coming from.
That is correct.
Now, we talked about a text message that was actually sent from Ms. Peters' phone, we look back at her record, that was sent to Mr. Segura's 509 number. I think earlier you said we can't get the contents of that from Sprint. Is that correct?
That's correct. Sprint at this time was not retaining the text message content, but Verizon was.
Were you able to go back and get that?
We were.
Okay. Do we have it?
We do. So taking that SMS messaging that we looked at earlier, we can see that 2:19 p.m. on the 19th to the disclosed phone that says, "Did you hang up on me?" And then there is, at 2:27, another incoming call from the undisclosed phone.
And looking at Ms. Peters' record, is that an indication that she's talking to anybody else other than that 408 number during that time frame, correct?
No.
All right, and then this call, this 408 number, and going back to the Verizon on the 408 right here, again, utilize the *67 feature, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. All right, so what's next?
Well,
If we've got a good stopping point, Mr. Chief, probably ought to take a little break.
Okay, can we save it, let's finish Ms. Peters, and then we'll go on?
Okay, I thought we were.
No, sir, I think
this is it right here, last.
Okay, so what are we looking at here?
So again, sort of surmising, and we kind of already mentioned it here, but we know that there was communication back and forth between Ms. Peters and Mr. Segura. The *67 would not identify to her what number she was being contacted from. The text message that was sent, clearly she thinks that she is talking to the disclosed phone, and then there's a communication back from the undisclosed phone.
Okay. Well, that indicate essentially that I believe Ms. Peters would be that she was talking to Mr. Segura on both phones.
It would certainly seem to be, yes.
Okay. All right, does that conclude the analysis, Ms. Peters?
It does.
Okay, great.
We take 10 minutes. Okay. Either side, anything?
No, sir.
All right, we'll be in recess.
You're not able to pick up the monitor because of the way it's screened.
I'm aware of it. If you're okay with it, I'm okay with it.
I have no problem with
Let's
them.
have it, Jerry.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Everybody be seated. You may proceed, Mr. Fuchs.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Corbett, what was the next analysis that you did?
The next thing that we looked at was a little more of the sort of text message activity that we saw from the Verizon records, and also how that related to a forensic exam we were able to do of Mr. Segura's handset.
Okay. What are we looking at here in this workshop?
Again, just an overview, reminding us of the various things that we're able to get from Verizon. And particular importance to this part would be that text message content, where we're able to, for a period of a few days, recover the text messages that were sent from Verizon.
And this appears to be the 509 number, which is the disclosed phone that Mr. Segura had, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
The other thing that we were able to do when we're able to actually have possession of a handset, then we can do a forensic exam, or where we can take that device and plug it into a machine and sort of extract some of the information that's within the phone. And sometimes that includes text message content and call logs and contacts and pictures and those kind of things. But another good source of information for us is when we do have the actual physical handset in conjunction with the things that we see from the carrier records.
And were you able to get the physical handset from Mr. Segura's 509 number?
Yes, we were.
Okay. And you say you're able to actually go in that, is there a certain, what's that called?
Well, we generally call it a Cellbrite, but Cellbrite is actually a brand name of a forensic software. But we call it just a forensic analysis. It's very similar to a computer analysis where we go in and maybe take an image of a hard drive and then look through the data that's on there and see what we can recover.
Okay. And were y'all able to do that in this particular case, Tallahassee Police Department?
We were, yes.
Okay. And Your Honor, for record purposes, we're now referring to the information that's being off of Mr. Segura's phone physically. This states exhibit 140, and that will be the Cellbrite of that particular phone.
It's my understanding that's already in evidence.
Yes, sir. It's already previously introduced in evidence. All right, so what are we looking at here?
So we were able to pull from that handset, the 509 handset, all of the text message content that was within the phone. And we don't have to see too much detail here. We'll look at the individual days later. But in essence, the Cellbrite report is able to take for us the date and time of an event, of a text message. If there's a contact name, it'll stick it in the slot for us and tell us, hey, this phone number is assigned this name, so we know who at least the person who's using the phone refers to that number as. And we have an indication whether it's sent or received and those kind of things. So we were able to get that text message log from Mr. Segura's disclosed handset.
Okay. And I think you looked first at the November 16th date, which is just before the homicide?
Yes, that's correct. So on the 16th, we saw that in the morning hours, 7:44, 7:46, 7:47, we had text messages that were originated from Mr. Segura's phone, actually to Mrs. Segura's phone number. As we had the text message content from the carrier, we were able to look at what the content of those messages were. So the first text message here at 7:44 a.m., we do have the text message.
Okay, and so the last report would be off the actual phone, and this report is from the cell phone company?
Yes, so this is from the cell phone provider. This is from Verizon, and this is again, the content that we were able to get from them.
Okay, and what does it say?
It says, I can't wait to get y'all taxes. I'm calling to IRS and tell them that y'all live together so I can get both of y'all money, LOL.
It looks like that's signed Queen B.
That is correct.
And if I'm not mistaken, we had previously seen a text message that was from Mrs. Peters' phone where she also signed it Queen B.
That is correct.
There any additional, I see we have some highlighted phone numbers here. But this is sent from Mr. Segura's phone to Mrs. Segura's phone?
That is correct.
Okay. I don't understand. How is it that
The most likely would be that Mr. Segura's phone received this text message from Ms. Peters, and then on this date and time, it was forwarded from his phone to his wife's phone.
All right. But you weren't able to get you didn't have the actual text that was sent from Mrs. Peters' phone to Mr. Segura's phone?
We have a number of text communication between them in the text log, but as far as how far back we could go with content, we did not see where this was sent to Mr. Segura's phone. But there are a number of text messages that we have no idea what the content was.
Okay, and is that because the provider doesn't keep them very long?
That is correct.
Okay. So presumably it would have been sent before this?
That is correct.
Okay. All right. What's next?
So the next text message of those three that were sent, 7:46, again, we also have the content of that from the carrier.
Okay, and what does it say?
Your mama da bitch, and I'm going to call them in the morning, so don't pay your ass, we'll be in jail.
And again, it's signed by Queen B.
That's correct.
Okay. And this is actually 4 days before the homicide, Tuesday before the homicide, correct?
Yeah, 16th is actually 3 days before.
Okay, yes, sir, sorry. All right,
Still, this is the third of those three text messages sent the morning of the 16th, again, from Mr. Segura's phone to Mrs. Segura's phone.
And what does this one say?
This one says, that's fine, you don't have to text back, but I'm going to see you in court. I'm calling them people today.
Okay. Well, appeared to indicate that she was not getting any return text messages from Mr. Segura's phone.
Would appear correct.
and again, signed from D.
Yes, sir.
Okay. What's next?
Well, if we then look at the text message that were recovered from the actual handset, we don't find these. We see that there are a number of text messages on the 15th, and we have to do a little time adjustment here. The phone is reporting those text messages in GMT, and we were right about daylight savings time here. So that's either 4 or 5 hours ahead of us. But regardless, for the 15th, those 3 text messages that we got from the carrier that we saw in the text message report were no longer on the handset.
How could that be?
Deleted.
So they apparently were deleted from the handset?
That is certainly an explanation, yes.
Okay. What's next?
So another day we looked at was the 19th, and we've talked about this one before, that we had an incoming text message from Ms. Peters at 2:19. We know that from Verizon, the content of that message was the "Did you hang up on me? What happened?"
All right, so this is the text message we're talking about beforehand.
That is correct.
Okay.
We also had some other, looking at the text message report, we had a number of text messages from Mrs. Segura's phone to Mr. Segura's phone throughout the day on the 19th. See 3:56, 4:15, 4:56, 5:04, and 8:14. So there were about 5 text messages that were sent from Mrs. Segura to Mr. Segura.
I'm sorry, if I can go back just a second to that phone, that other text message we talked about on the 19th, was that found on the phone?
Well, it was not, and we're sort of looking at all the text messages on the 19th, and then we'll go and look in the phone and see what we found. But no,
Okay.
it was not there.
All right, so these are messages that are now being sent on the 19th between Mr. Segura's phone and Mrs. Segura's phone.
Correct.
Okay. Did you get content for those?
We did. From the carrier, we were able to see what that text message content was. So the top one there, 11:19, 3:56, we can see the originating number and the terminating number, again from Mrs. Segura to Mr. Segura. And that first message says, "Call me back."
Okay.
Then 4:15, there is a text message that says, "Answer the phone." And
Appears to
again,
indicate that there's no communication going on. Well, again, this is the 509 phone number for Mr. Segura, correct?
that is correct. So it would indicate that Mrs. Segura is trying to reach Mr. Segura without success.
And his phone is showing passive during this time period, correct?
That is correct.
Everything's incoming, nothing outgoing.
Yes.
Okay. What's next?
So we saw there were a couple other text messages a little later on that day. So the next text message we saw said, "I need to stay late." And then one at 5:04 that said, again, "I will never get ahead at work, can't depend on you."
Again, all receiving on Mr. Segura's phone, but all passive, nothing response, nothing going out.
That is correct.
Okay.
So then the last text message sent was actually broke apart into 2 parts, but this is the 8:14 text message, again from Mrs. Segura to Mr. Segura.
And what does that say?
That is, "I am so through with you being such a fucked up husband. You are no one that I can seem to depend on since you get lost so easy. I need you to have my back again today, and you were nowhere to be found. I think that I finally get the hint that you don't have my back, so why should I have yours?"
Again, on the 19th, this appears to be, am I doing the math right, about 8 o'clock, 8:15?
Yes, 8:15, yes.
All right, again, a passive event, nothing.
Yeah, so
Outgoing.
we saw those text messages that seemed to indicate she was trying to reach him. So if we go back to the call detail records, I would expect to see, calls from her into the phone. And in fact, if we filter out for just Mrs. Segura's numbers, we see that there were a number of calls starting at 1:22, 2 o'clock, 2:08, 3, 4, throughout the daytime there that are from either her cell phone or work number. And those are all, as we see in the direction column on Mr. Segura's phone, forwarded or terminated. They're all incoming, but they did not appear to be answered.
And they all seem to have a duration where it appears that it's working anything left or something along those lines.
That would be correct. 30 seconds is about what it takes to connect and decide whether you're going to leave a voicemail or not.
Okay, all right. What's next?
So we have all of those, and then again, we look at the forensic report from the phone, and for the 19th, we have some events, but we do not see the text message from Ms. Peters, and we do not see these text messages from Mrs. Segura from the evidence we recovered actually within the phone.
All right, so the cell part of the phone, the analysis of the cell phone indicate that any of the text messages from Ms. Peters are not present,
Correct.
as well as any of the text messages from Mrs. Segura indicating that Mr. Segura was not home on the 19th are also missing.
That's correct.
Okay. What's next?
So everything, if we go to the text message log for the 19th and compare it to what was found in the phone, we see that there are a number of text messages between Mr. and Mrs. Segura and at least one or two from Ms. Peters that were not present. So everything highlighted are things that were not in the phone. The things that are not highlighted were the text messages that were still there.
So it's not like he erased everything. He just erased those two particular conversations.
We did not find those two particular conversations, correct?
But the other conversations, the other things that were found out were still present in the phone.
That's correct.
Okay, what's next?
So one of the other text message strings of interest was on the 22nd, which is a few days after the homicide. We see that this is an outgoing text message from Mr. Segura's phone to a 210-4515, and it asked the question, "Are you up?" And then there was a text message at 11:15 that morning, a few hours later, again from Mr. Segura's to the 210-4515. And this message says, "I wasn't sure how to say it on the phone, but I just wanted him to come get this car. He don't have to give me nothing for it. I just want it gone."
So he's trying to get rid of, apparently according to that text message, he's trying to get rid of a certain car.
It would seem so, yes.
Okay, what's next?
So again, as we see reference here, I wasn't sure how to say it on the phone. We would go back to the phone records to see if there was actually phone communication between them. And we do actually see on the 22nd, there are a number of voice calls, either attempted or completed calls, especially one here at 9:05 that's 1,000 seconds long between Mr. Segura's phone and that 210-4515. So there was telephone contact that seemed to be referenced in the text message. Then if we look at the text messages that were recovered from the phone, we can see that the early morning one, which again, if we do the math here, makes our time work out right, that says, "Are you up?" So that text message is still on the phone. But the one later in the day about the car is not in the phone. So these are the rest of the text messages for the 22nd and actually into the 23rd. And we did not find that second text message.
Again, so it appears that Mr. Peters' conversation's missing, Ms. Segura's conversation's missing, and that one particular text message about getting rid of a car is missing, but nothing else is missing that you're aware of.
In these strings, correct. So here we can see that from the text message report, the 803 message is there, but the 1115 message is not.
Okay.
And I believe that's what I had for that.
All right. At some point, did you start going in and looking at Mr. Segura's phones and the records as far as the actual call content and distancing and things like that?
Yes, we did.
Okay. Is that what we're going to look at next?
Yes, the next thing we looked at was, just as we did for the Wednesday and the Saturday after, we looked at the location information for the day and evening of the homicide itself.
All right. Can we take a look at that, please?
We can. It'll take me just a second.
Yes, sir. All right, so what are we looking at here with this first slide?
Again, just our overview slide. We know that there's a couple of addresses of interest, that being Mr. Segura's residence and Ms. Peters' residence, and again, all the Verizon cell sites around the area there that we expect the handsets to be communicating with.
Okay. Did you take a look at that information as it relates to the 509 phone number?
We did. The 509 or the disclosed phone, we looked at the call detail records for the 19th, and we see that there are a number of events in the records. And if we look at those sort of in detail, we take out the other columns, we can see that at 12:30 the morning or the early afternoon of the 19th, we have an originated event. And then everything 122, 134, 155, we see that these are all now the mobile terminated or the mobile forwarded. So these are the passive events. There's nothing that appears originating or outgoing until actually a call the morning of the 20th. So everything on the disclosed phone at this point is passive. or not indicating that someone's actually manipulating the phone or using it.
Okay.
The SMS events from that report are also passive. They're all incoming, meaning every one of them, we can see 10:55 in the morning through the 8:14 in the evening. All of those are inbound to the 509 or to the disclosed phone.
Okay.
In our RTT report, our distancing report, all of those events, even though they weren't answered, they still do provide us location information. So we see that all those communicated with our Verizon 850 Sector 2 again, which we see often.
Did you do your distancing?
We did. We have the distancing information here and also our additional distancing information. And again, as we've seen before, this distancing would be consistent with that handset being at Mr. Segura's residence.
Okay. And that's compared to the one that we did back on the 17th, where we know that the resident spoke with the early morning hours with the 408 and then his 509 number and all that.
That is correct.
Okay. Did you take a look at the 408 number, the undisclosed phone?
We did. And the 408 phone, we do have a variety of events occurring during the day. And here we see that not only do we have the mobile forwarded, but we do have mobile originated. So we have outgoing events or active events. And all of these events are present in our distancing report, our RTT report. So we can see that we have some outgoing text messages, incoming text message. There seems to be more use or activity out of this handset.
And this is, again, the 408 undisclosed phone, right?
That is correct.
All right.
So the first thing that we looked at was the first two events here. This is just afternoon, 12:32, 12:36, or early afternoon of the 19th. And we see right here from the records, our old friend 850 Sector 2. And if we put that on the map, we can see it here. Our distancing, again, as we've seen before, our additional distancing. So those two events are, again, very consistent with what we've seen when the handsets were at Mr. Segura's residence.
Let me stop you right here real quick. We looked at some dates on the 17th. We also looked at 20th dates and compared them with essentially what we believe to be known locations of Mr. Segura and looked at the data. What is the importance of doing something like that?
Well, first of all, it sort of helps us make sure that our analysis is correct. If I know that someone is at a particular place in a particular time, and I look at their records, then I expect those records to be consistent with that, to be communicating with a cell site and a sector and a distance that's approximately consistent with that. So we do it both to verify our information, to make sure that the records we see are accurate, to verify the stories that we're being told, is it accurate or not. So it's sort of a verification for us to look at those known locations.
Okay. Looks like, Nick, we looked at the afternoon hours.
It did. We can see there are a series of events, both voice calls and SMS or text messages. We can see that they all kind of communicate with 847, Sector 1 or Sector 2. Our distancing is pretty similar here. So we kind of looked at those as a group. Since they're all going to look about the same on the map, we kind of take a look at those as a group.
I think 847 is the one right there by the speaker zone.
Yep, that's the tower that we've seen before. It's right there on McNeil Boulevard, just down Woodville Highway. We see that we're using these two sectors of that cell site during this time, and we do have distancing information. So our distancing information for all those events, again, relatively consistent during that time period, and we do have some additional distancing that we can plot as well.
And again, this is just prior to the homicides, it's the day of the homicide. But at this point, we still have an active communication on the Segura's phone after this, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And in fact, there's a long phone call, so we believe he'll still be alive during this time period, correct?
Correct.
Okay, but it shows him being in the area of her home.
Consistent with, yes.
Okay. Next, if we look like we're doing that a little later.
Yeah, we had a little break in time here, and we have a couple of events where we see a change in cell sites. May or may not mean that the handset moved. Again, we know that we have a tendency every once in a while to reach out and talk to a cell site that's a little further away. But we look at these two events together, and we see this first one here at 5:45, communicated with Verizon 849. It's our cell site that's down Woodville Highway. We have distancing for that, which again, not inconsistent at all with Ms. Peters' residence. We have the 601 event, which we've gone even further now to a cell site that's way down on Oak Ridge Road. We're a pretty good distance from it. The distance that it reports is long, still puts us back up inside a Capitol Circle, but consistent or not with Ms. Peters' residence.
And again, this is 6:01, it looks like, so at this point, we still have the cell phone, the conversation following this, that where Ms. Peters is actually on a call, and that, of course, that active text that was sent at 6:53.
That's correct.
Okay, what are we looking at next?
So the next little grouping that we see here is from 6:05 to about 6:33. And again, we go back and we see our 847.1 and our 849, so we know where those are. We see some pretty consistent distancing, so we kind of look at those as a group as well. Again, we have our 847, our 849. And as these events are all text messages, we just have the one distancing event for them. But when we look at that on the map, that's what we have for those events.
Okay, and it looks like next we're looking at 6:23.
7:23, yes. So now here, maybe 50 minutes later, we have, again, kind of a little bit of a change. We have a data session. Our distance has changed just a little bit. So we look at these two events, and we say that they, again...
Can you go back to those just real quick?
I can.
Okay. A couple questions I have here. Is there any kind of communication, active communication, between that prior 6:33 time period and that 7:23 time period on Mr. Segura's phone?
The RTT report would contain all the activity there was, whether it was a data session or text message or a phone call. So in this report, we see that terminating text message at 6:33, and then the next event in the records is this originating data session at 7:23. So there would be no events, no activity between that time frame.
And if I recall correctly, Ms. Peters' cell phone, the last activity on it was at 6:53, so her phone up to this 7:23 time period is also inactive.
That is correct.
Okay. What is the 7:23 time period with?
So we have our two cell sites that we've seen. We have distancing information from those two. One we see is a little long, one's as short as we usually see. And we had some additional distancing information for those two events that, again, not inconsistent with the area.
Okay. You say it's not inconsistent. I see one kind of up here. How is that not inconsistent?
Well, we know from our use of the information and testing that we subsequently did that the distancing can be off. So while I could not exclude that area, I certainly couldn't exclude her home from being within the error range of that data.
Okay. All right. It looks like next we're going to 8:21.
That's correct. The next event after the 7:37 we see is 8:21, and it's an originating voice call now.
All right. And anything in between that that prior time period that we had at 7, I think it was 33, between that 8:21?
There is nothing. There was sort of two events there at 7:23, the 7:37 event, nothing in between that and the 8:21.
And if I recall correctly, Ms. Peters' phone is also inactive during that time period, as it previously was not active after that 6:53 time period.
That's correct. I believe it was the 8:12 phone call that was not in the per call report. So,
and if I also recall correctly, Ms. Peters' phone went, I guess, inactive or stopped communicating with the network also at 8:21 exactly.
well, as I was saying, I believe, and we have to go back, I don't want to misquote the time, but I think it was 8:12 or 8:14, whenever that incoming phone call that she had was. And that is the one that we did not see in the per call report. So we had the data sessions just prior to 7. We did not have that phone call. So somewhere in that time frame, yes, is when her phone leaves.
Okay, if I recall correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was a 7:14 call that was actually routed, but it was actually picked up by the voicemail, and there was an 8:21 at that point that was routed that was not. Is that correct, or am I incorrect there?
Yes, it is. The 7:13 is the one that we have that came into the phone, and it was 8:21 and 52 hundredths of a second is the one that we did not see. So 8:21 is the one that we do not see in the per call report. So somewhere just prior to this time, we know that something happened to Ms. Peters' handset.
Okay. So what are we looking here at this 8:21 on Mr. Segura's phone?
So the distancing here is just a smidge longer than what we had seen in the other events. And if we plot the additional distancing, now the handset is communicating with some other cell sites. The cell site here behind Rickards High School, one over here. And if we kind of look at that convergence of where those distances are, it's more consistent with the area up here.
And it looks like that's just off of Paul Russell Road, which is also something we saw previously on the 17th.
That is correct.
Okay. So next we're looking at 9:30.
So 9:30, the next event that we have after the 821 is the 9:30, and that is, again, our 850 Sector 2, so we can guess where that is. We see that on the map of Verizon 850 Sector 2. Our distancing and our initial distancing is consistent with that handset now having returned.
All right. And then you compare the two.
We did, just as we looked at on the 17th for this time frame in between our active events, we see that the disclosed handset was primarily or exclusively using our 850 Sector 2, and our undisclosed handset was now using these cell sites up here. And if we look at the distancing for those, again, not consistent with those two handsets being together.
And the undisclosed phone at 408 is not consistent with him being at home until lawful.
That is correct.
Was that the end that completed your analysis of this information in this case?
It did, yes.
For Mr. Segura's phone?
For Mr. Segura's phone, yes.
Did you do any initial analysis?
We did.
Did you conduct an experiment, I guess?
We did, actually.
Okay, and what was that, if you can tell the jury?
Again, we talked about wanting to sort of verify our data, make sure that our analysis was correct. And one of the ways was to look at known locations and look at the records and verify that those things were there. But one of the other options that we had is we knew the make and model of the handset, this undisclosed handset. It's actually in the records. So we knew what kind of phone it was, and we knew the service that it had. So we decided that we could get an identical phone with identical service, and we could go out and create our own events. So we would go to known locations, fixed places. We would make our own text messages, voice calls, data sessions, and then get our own records, and then compare what the records said, where we knew exactly where we were. Then we wanted to see what those records told us. So that would help verify our analysis as well, and we did that.
Okay, and did you utilize Mr. Thornton, who I believe was the originator of that phone, in order to help you obtain?
That is correct. He provided us a confirmation of that. Again, we see the make and model in the records themselves, so we knew, and Mr. Thornton was able to confirm the handset that was in Mr. Segura's possession.
Okay. I'm showing some previously introduced, I believe it's been introduced in evidence, that's 123. I should take a look at that.
Yes, sir.
Do you recognize that?
I do.
What is that?
That is the Verizon LG 290C phone that we purchased to do our experiment with.
Okay. And Your Honor, permission to publish that to the jury?
Sure, that'd be nice.
All your other paperwork's in there.
And I believe you said that you essentially hooked this phone up.
We did.
Did you also utilize the Verizon network as the 408 number was utilizing it?
We did. We actually subscribed for service. It's through Straight Talk, but it's serviced by Verizon Wireless, a prepaid carrier. So we got our own service, paid for it, activated the phone, and went out and made some events.
Okay. And did you also request the cellular phone data information from Verizon following your test?
Yes, we did.
Okay. And I assume you obtained it?
We did.
And Your Honor, that's been previously introduced into evidence as 139. Did you have an opportunity to go back and verify that information contained in State Exhibit 139 and verify that it was the information you were provided from Verizon?
Yes, I was.
And did you prepare any visual aids and help with that analysis?
I did.
Can you show that to us, please?
I can.
All right. what are we looking at here?
So again, that RTT report or that Verizon distancing report way at the far end of the report actually tells us the make and model of that handset. So we get to see that it is a manufacturer of LG and that model LG290C. So that helped us confirm the phone that Mr. Thornton showed us. It is the same make and model as you saw in the box there. So we went out and acquired our own handset. It's the one that you just saw. And as we look at it, we can confirm that it is an LG290C handset.
Your Honor, can I actually dim the lights again, please? Now, what are we looking at here? What are these blue dots?
The blue dots are all the places that we went and created our events from.
Okay. And how did you go about figuring out where you're going to create an event?
They were locations of interest to the investigation. Clearly, the incident scene, Mr. Segura's residence, friends or family members that may or may not have been locations we could have been at, other things that were discovered during the investigation that where someone was reported to be, they said, hey, I'm here right now, and we have records, then I might go to that place and create my own records just to see if mine matches theirs. So there were 11 locations that we picked based on things that were relevant to the investigation.
And when you say events, were you just making phone calls? What were you doing?
No, we did them all. We did voice calls, text messages, and data sessions. Even that many years ago, that little phone had a very basic web browser to it, so we could go on and initiate some data traffic that would cause the data sessions that we saw in our original records for Mr. Segura's phones.
And approximately how many, I guess, events did you create at these different locations?
Oh, it varied on the locations, but we ended up with just under 100 events across this experiment.
All right. Location number 1098 Mustang Drive. What are we talking about there?
That's correct. That's Mr. Segura's residence. So we knew that we had a lot of events where the distancing and the cell site seemed consistent. So we wanted to make sure that our phone showed the same thing. So again, 850 Sector 2 is the sector that our handset utilized. Our distancing, very similar to what we've seen before, coming up again just short of where we actually were. And like some of the other events, we did have some additional distancing that came in from the other cell site on the other side. Again, as we've seen in the other times we've looked at this address, our distancing was very similar to what we saw in the other handsets.
And I notice we're using blue arrows and blue lines.
Yes.
Dallas Police Department.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. So location number 2 looks like you were on Crawfordville Highway.
That is correct.
What's the significance of this location?
Through the investigation, we learned there was some communication with Mr. Segura where he stated that he was just passing the Publix, and this is our Publix right here on Crawfordville Highway. So it's something we might compare the records to. We wanted to go to that location as well and see what our events look like.
Okay. And I believe that was Ms. Hawthorne Smith that provided that information?
That is correct.
Did you go back and look at Mr. Segura's records to ensure that that communication actually happened?
It did.
Okay. All right. And what time, do you remember what time that was, by any chance?
Not off the top of my head. It was the later evening hours.
Around 10:15, something like that?
It was, yes.
Okay. All right. So did you do the distancing on this as well?
We did. We, as expected, were communicating with a cell site that's relatively close. We can see our distancing, which again comes up just a little short, and our additional distancing where we're able to communicate with another cell site up here, consistent with where we were at.
Okay. And again, was that consistent also with information that Ms. Hawthorne Smith's communication with Ms. Segura on that day?
Yes, it was.
Okay. Next location looks like Lakewood Drive.
That's correct.
What is the significance of this location?
A family member's residence here?
Okay. When you say family member, Mr. Segura's family member?
Yes, correct.
Okay. And where is this? Where are we looking at here?
So we're just south of Tram Road. So this is 4 Points, our Woodville Highway, the cell site that we've been talking about, mostly 847 is right here, and our victim's residence is right here on Saddle Creek.
So the same general area of Ms. Peters' home, same tower, but a different location.
That's correct, relatively close.
Okay. Did you do the tower and distancing analysis on this one?
We did. Here for our events, we communicated with Verizon 847. We saw our distancing, which again was consistently just a little bit short. And our additional distancing, we really didn't communicate with any other cell sites while we were at that location. Not to be unexpected, as we were relatively close to that tower, you would expect it to be the one that the phone consistently saw best. And so our event was, all of our events communicate with that one cell site.
And it appears as if these lines of communication that we're talking about, the RCT lines, are well south of Train Road.
They are, yes.
Okay.
Tram Road is here, and our events are definitely short of Tram Road.
And going back to the analysis of the 408 number, is it, it's my understanding that the RTD data lines were north of Train Road, where they passed in that area?
That is correct.
Okay, so that's not consistent.
It is not.
Okay. Next, you went to Gale Avenue.
Correct.
What's the significance of this address?
Again, another family member of Mr. Segura.
Okay, this also looks like it's at Tram Road area, just south of Tram Road.
It is. It's very close to where we were. We were just over here on Lakewood. Here is our Gale Avenue address, and again, Miss Peters' neighborhood is right here.
Okay. Again, you're getting closer to Miss Peters' neighborhood.
That is correct.
All right. Did you do the tower and distancing analysis on this?
We did. Again, our same Verizon 847 that we've seen. Our distancing and additional distancing.
Again, it appears that the arcs, if you will, are south of Tram Road.
That is correct.
And they're actually short of your known location.
That is correct.
Okay, but that's also still inconsistent with the data that came off that 408 number, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Next location appears to be Kendall Drive.
We did. A friend of Mr. Segura's. So we went to this location and created events. We saw our cell sites. Again, as we talked earlier, we know that Ridge Road here is a little bit of sort of a high point. And as we start down that other side, we would expect that we would probably communicate with different cell sites than what we did if we were on the other side of the hill. And in fact, we did. We have the cell site here at Rickards and the cell site up on Putnam.
And so this looks like it's in between Paul Russell Road and the Orange Avenue, I mean, almost in the vicinity of the high school, it looks like.
That is correct.
Okay. Okay, there's distance.
Distancing information and our additional distancing information again.
Okay, so that's totally different tower and distancing information that's not consistent with that 408 number on that date.
That is correct.
Okay. Next, it looks like we went to Paul Russell Road.
Correct. This was an acquaintance of Mr. Segura's, Ms. Hawthorne Smith's residence.
Okay.
Again, we see our cell site, our distancing, and the additional distancing.
All right, this looks like it's almost a capital circle in Orange Avenue.
It is, yes, absolutely. So our area that we've been looking at is down here on Jim Lee Road. Now we've moved significantly further east and an area just south of St. Augustine along Capitol Circle.
Again, inconsistent with the data that you got from the 408 phone number.
That's correct.
All right, what's the next location you want to do?
Jack McLean Park. Here again, being on the ridge, we would kind of expect to see some different events. And again, we see our 847 that's south, and we see the other cell sites that are north. And again, kind of being there on the top, we would expect that we might see those. We have our distancing and our additional distancing. And some of those, we were able to see some cell sites a good distance away, all the way over here.
Okay. Now this information looks relatively close. You have Paul Russell Road right here, relatively close to that 821 event on that 408 number. Is that correct?
It does. On the 821 event, we do actually pick up the cell site that's over here to the left. We pick up the cell site at Rickards. So there are definitely some consistencies between our information here and that 821 event.
All right. Next location appears to be Jim Lee Road.
It is, yes. And so this is actually the parking lot of the church that is behind Miss Peters' residence, and it's actually her residence is right here. So we're real close to her residence, but we're also going up the hill a little bit now. So we're a little higher, we can see out a little better. So we were curious what cell sites we might communicate if we were north of her residence.
Okay, and did you do the cell tower and distancing analysis on this?
We did, and we saw here our 847 and our 849, which we've seen in other records. We have our distancing information here, which most are consistent. We have a couple that fall short, again, as we've seen previously.
Okay, let me stop you right there. Those fall short, and I think if we go back to the 408, there's actually one that went well past.
Yes.
previously indicated. Is that, and I think there was actually a phone call that was, or some sort of data session that were like 7 seconds apart that were substantial distance apart. And I guess I'm going to call them a flyer because you'd have to be in a plane to fly that far that quick. Are things like that, these flyers, are they, did you find them both in your test phone as well as the analysis of the 408 number?
Yes, absolutely. So here is our test phone. This is our data. I know exactly where I was. I wasn't flying at the speed of light one direction or another, but these are the distances that we received. So we definitely saw that, you know, our closer cell sites were usually more accurate. As we started communicating with cell sites almost out of the county, then our reported distance could be off a little bit. But we do see that we have a couple of distances a little short, a couple of distances a little long.
You got a lot of experience analyzing things. Are these flyers, if you will, something you normally see?
It is. We might look at, and we use the distancing data a lot to locate people, missing persons, wanted persons, those kind of things. And if I look at a report and I see a period of time where I think, you know, someone may be asleep or, you know, at their house and there's 20 events and 18 of them are nice and consistent, and there's a couple that are, you know, a little long, a little short. Just as a matter of practical analysis, I would eliminate those and I would look at what is most consistent, and that's the area that I would go and look for this person, because I knew that every once in a while we do see those that represent a little short or a little long.
Okay. So essentially, if I understand you correctly, then even though you get those, you still have to look at everything as a whole, but your experience has shown you that those things happen on occasion.
Sure. If I'm looking for someone, I'm going to the average. I'm going to where, you know, they're most likely to be. If I'm going to say where someone may or may not have been, then I have to look at what the possible error of the data could be.
Okay. Next location, Prosecution Drive. What's the significance of that?
This is just the entrance to her neighborhood, to Miss Peters' neighborhood. So this is directly off Tram Road. You can see we're just right here in. There's a little parking area. Miss Peters' residence is here. So again, we're very close to her residence. We're a little bit further down that hill. And again, we just want to see, hey, if we're this close to her residence, what does our information look like?
And I think we previously talked about an exit being up there at Paul Russell Road. Does that mean there's 2 entrances and exits to the neighborhood?
There are 2. There's one that comes out right here on Tram Road, the main entrance to the neighborhood, and then you can exit Jim Lee Road up to Paul Russell.
All right, so the north and the south entrance.
Correct.
Okay.
By vehicle.
All right.
So we saw our cell sites here, our distancing, and our additional distancing. So everything that we have, again, a little bit short of where we actually were and shorter than the other data that we had seen.
All right. Next, it looks like you went to the location at 908 South Front.
We did. This is Miss Peters' residence, and we did events both inside and outside the residence. And these first ones here are ones that we did in the driveway outside.
Okay. And did you do the cell tower and distancing analysis?
We did. We saw our same 847, 849 that we've been seeing in other records. We have our distancing. And again, even here, we have one from this further away cell site that comes up a little short, one a little long. But if we look at the bulk of the data, we can see that it's much closer to the other data that we had seen previously.
And in looking at this, I know that we talked previously about that line for the segment, and this one appears to be hitting off 2 different sectors. Again, we're outside the home, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And because it's on that line, essentially, is that why we're looking at 2 different sectors like that?
Yeah, let me see if I can make this work here. So we had talked previously about the sector break, and that somewhere between Sector 1 and Sector 2 is where we would expect that phone to start transitioning from one side to the other. And we can see that when we were at the entrance or to the neighborhood, we were more over here, and most of our data was with this one. Here, we're a little bit closer to that transition line, so we can understand that the handset may be trying to make a choice between which side of that it sees the best. And knowing that it's not in a real good spot is why it looks to that one that's even further away. Because even though it's further away, it's more in kind of the sweet spot of that sector, so it may want to communicate with it more often.
And I think that, thinking back to the 408 analysis, it was not hitting off of both these sectors. It was only hitting off one, correct?
At different parts of the day, it communicated with both sectors, and sometimes it was just the Sector 1 or the one that's more facing towards the north.
Okay. All right. So what's the next location?
So the next location was actually inside of her residence. We went into her residence. It was still vacant at the time, and created a series of events in the living room.
All right, and did you do the tower and distance analysis?
We did.
on that one?
Cell site here, so inside we're communicating with the same 847, 849. We have our distancing for these events here,
This
and
is actually inside the home, correct?
this is actually inside our home, yes.
Okay, and I noticed that these are now north of Tram Road.
That is correct.
Okay. And this is the distancing and additional.
So when we bring in the additional distancing again, we have one event that comes up short down here. But if we look at the bulk of our information and our primary distancing, that first initial reported distance, we usually find to be a little more accurate. The secondary distance or those others, they're not reported to as many decimal places, so we automatically lose a little bit of accuracy there. So we like to look at the primary distances, but we certainly don't exclude those additional distances as well.
Okay. After getting all this information from your phone that you know where your locations are inside the home of Brandy Peters, did you go back and do an analysis between the primary data obtained from the 408 phone number and this information you got from Mr. Segura's phone? I mean, from his phone.
Yes, we did. And again, knowing that some of our distances were going to be very, very similar, we wanted a way to represent these to where that we could see them both. And so if we look at our data in blue and the 408 data, and we're talking about those series of events after 6, text messages, we just have primary distances for those, so we're looking at our primary distances. And we can see that our data and the 408's data is extremely consistent.
I have no further questions.
Cross. You gonna be referring up here, Mr. Prince?
No, Your Honor. Not unless the witness needs to, I suppose. Investigator Corbett, I want to start by asking you about the sequence of communications between the 408 number, the defendant's girlfriend phone, and the victim's handset. You summarized those with Mr. Fuchs. You have a copy of the text messages that were obtained from Mr. Segura's phone, correct?
That's correct.
You also have a copy of the text messages to his primary phone that were obtained from the carrier, correct?
That is correct.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
And I know this isn't the actual exhibit that was in evidence, but is that a true and accurate copy of the same information?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And clarify for the record which particular text message report we're looking at.
So this is the text message report, the Verizon text message report with the actual content in it. And it's the same ones that we looked at for Mr. Segura's primary phone, the 509 number, where we could actually see the content of those messages and read them out.
Okay. And that text message right there was sent from Ms. Peters' phone to the defendant's primary phone on Thursday the 18th, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. What time during the day was that text message sent?
That was at 9:58 a.m.
And what is the content of the text message?
The content is, you was looking good. If you wasn't my baby daddy, I would have given you some, LOL.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
So the sequence of events in terms of communications, we have the text messages that were forwarded to Mrs. Segura, Malika Segura's phone from the defendant on Tuesday the 16th, correct?
That's correct.
About child support, apparently about child support. And is that correct?
It is, yes.
And then on the 17th, we have cell phone location information for the defendant's 408 phone number showing that he went over to the victim's home, or at least at a location consistent with her home.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And then on the 18th, that's when she sends the text message saying that he looks good and she would have hooked up with him if he wasn't her baby daddy.
That's correct.
Okay. I want to ask you about what happens between the two of their handsets following that communication. Are there calls from Mr. Segura to Ms. Peters following the text message from her? I'm specifically referencing the ones at 10:02 and 10:08 on the 18th.
I will have to bring up.
Oh, and before you go there, one other question about the text message you read. That one was also deleted from the defendant's phone, correct?
That's
That was in the
correct.
list? Yes.
So I'm sorry, you want to talk about the 18th?
Yes, sir.
And call. So I will look at Ms. Peters' records for the 18th. And your question, sir?
There are, immediately after she sends that text message to him at 9:58, we have a call from him to her at 10:02 first, right?
That is correct.
That one's about 2 minutes long.
Correct.
And then we have a long call between the two of them beginning at 10:05 p.m., correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And of course, there's nothing in these records that would let you know what those calls are about, right?
That's correct.
Okay. I'm sorry to jump back for a second, but I want to clarify that during the time you referenced on the 17th, when the defendant's 408 number is consistent with a location, is consistent with being at the victim's house, the location information provided is consistent with being at her house, his primary phone number, the 509-4380 number, is at a location consistent with his home, correct?
That is correct.
So when he went up there on the 17th, he left the primary phone at home as well?
It would appear, yes.
Okay. I want to ask you a couple questions about the star 67 as well. In the records that we've discussed here and that you reviewed, every time he's calling her number, meaning Mr. Segura is calling the victim's number from his 408 phone, it's always star 67, correct?
Yes, everything that we've looked at, it appears that each time he uses the star 67, and she was unaware of that undisclosed phone number.
Right. So it's like when she looks at her screen, when it comes in, it's going to say blocked or unknown or something like that.
Correct.
Okay. So she wouldn't be able to save that 408 number as a contact in her phone?
She would not.
Okay. And so if someone were to take that physical handset, it's not as if they would be able to see in her phone that he was saved as a contact associated with that 408 number. Her handset wouldn't show that.
The handset wouldn't show if they were saved as a contact, but it would certainly show text message content and other things that would be within that phone.
There were no text messages from the 408 number to her phone or vice versa, were there?
Not from the 408.
Right. So there would be nothing in her actual handset to connect the 408 number to Henry Segura. It would have to come from records from the carrier.
If we didn't have the text message content for both the 408 and the 509 numbers, again, we go back to that text message that says, did you hang up on me or what? We know that went from Ms. Peters to the primary phone and then a call back from the undisclosed phone. If we were unable to get the records from the carrier, then that text message would still been in Ms. Peters' phone if we had it. And we could have seen that she sent a text message to Mr. Segura's phone, which we can see in the records, but then we would have had the actual content. So we were lucky that we were able to get it from the carrier, but the phone would have been another source for that text message.
In referencing that text message real quickly here, that isn't actually the totality of the communication, right? Isn't what she actually says, did you hang up on me? What happened? Isn't that what she said?
Yes.
Okay. So it wasn't as if it was clear to her that he had just clicked the phone off. She didn't know if it got cut off or what.
Correct. It would
Okay.
indicate some abrupt end to a communication.
As typically happens with cell phone carriers.
Unfortunately, yes.
So going back to, I want to be clear though about the last question that I was asking. There are no text communications between the 408 number and Brandy's number, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. I want to jump now to some of the communications for Mr. Segura's 408 phone number during the daytime of the 19th. Starting with there's a set of 3 communications starting at 13:23 and running through 13:26. You see those?
I do, yes.
Okay. And I know you explained this, but I want to go back and clarify. What does it mean when there are calls in rapid sequence like that over a short period of time that are jumping sector lines? First it's in sector 1 of the same tower, then it's in sector 2 of the same tower.
Well, if they are changing sectors and the calls are in relatively close time frame, seconds or a couple of minutes apart, then either one, we believe that the person is very rapidly moving from the good part of one cell to the other part of the other cell, or they could be much closer to that division line, that point where the two cells kind of overlap. And the handset, based on the event, may choose one or the other.
Okay. And the victim's house in this case is pretty close to that sector line, correct?
It is.
So using the fact that the Mr. Segura's phone is jumping the sector line during the time frame we're talking about and the distance reported from the primary tower, I guess you would opine that his handset is at a location consistent with her house or at a location near her house during that time frame, correct?
Certainly could be, yes.
Okay. And preceding those calls, we actually have another one of the long calls, long communications between the defendant's 408 phone and the victim's phone. Is that right? Starting at 11:30 a.m. on the 19th?
That's correct.
And how long exactly was that call?
It's 3,340 seconds.
Okay, so they talk on the phone for a long time that morning, and then we have him at a location consistent with her house around 1:30.
That's correct.
Okay. And from 1:41 to 3:05, he's only communicating, his handset is only communicating with Sector 1 of Tower 847, correct?
I'm sorry, you're 145 for which handset?
I'm only going to ask now about his 408 phone number.
Okay.
So from 1341, all the way up to 1505, there's no communications from Mr. Segura's 408 phone number that go to Sector 2 as the primary sector for Tower 847, correct?
Well, I'm looking at his actual calls. Are you referring to, yes, so you're talking about not just the call log, but you're talking about the RTT report, which has text messages. So there's not a call at 1341, but there is a text message. So
Right.
yes.
Okay, so all of those are in Sector 1.
After that, from 1341, all of the events, both voice and SMS until the 305 are in Sector 1, yes.
Okay. I want to jump for a second to some of the locations that you discussed during the course of telling us how you did your experiment with the dummy phone here. Can you tell me which of those locations are in Sector 1 of Tower 847? You understand what I'm asking?
Well, you're asking me which of the locations are in Sector 1. So the Sector 1 of 847 is a tower there at McNeil Boulevard, and Sector 1 is a tower or the sector that faces kind of northeast. And we saw, when I drew on the screen, we saw about where that split was. So really anything from probably about the entrance of that neighborhood, kind of around that direction, would favor more Sector 1 than Sector 2.
So northeast basically of Tower 847 is where we'd be looking.
Yes, probably from maybe 2 o'clock around would probably be about where we would look at.
And of the locations that you mentioned before, those locations would include the church and church parking lot slightly north of the victim's house, correct?
That's correct.
And also the defendant's sister's home, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now that we've started to touch on the experiment that you did a little bit, I want to ask about the calculation of error range. You mentioned some of the flyers and also mentioned how you average them out. Tell me if I'm wrong. Did I also hear you say, though, that when you're trying to figure out where someone was as opposed to knowing where they are, like when you know somebody's sleeping at a particular spot, you have to use all of the data and to figure out the possible error range. Is that right?
Yes. So again, if I'm looking for someone and I'm trying to find them, then I'm going to look at all the very consistent pieces of data because I know there's going to be a flyer here or there, but they're going to be in that where that meat of that information is. If you're going to say, well, for one event, where is it possible that they could have been? Well, then yes, and I have to take into account what I saw as the worst error. But again, even with that, I can say, well, that may be the worst for that one event, but if I have 10 events and only one of them is that bad, then the other 9 to me kind of weigh that it's more likely to be towards the good part of that data than towards those flyers. But for each individual event, yes, I do have to take into account the minimum maximum.
Okay, and so using the set of data that you gathered from your experiment, which includes the flyers, as you term them, for Tower 847, the maximum plus or minus error range was 0.64 miles, correct?
I believe, and I'm trying to catch up with you here to get my spreadsheet open that has that, but it was around that distance, yes.
Feel free to take your time and look at it.
So for the 847 sector, you're talking about 847-1, again, our McNeil Boulevard sector there. The worst that I saw was just over 0.6 of a mile.
Okay. And again, what you're doing in this case in terms of investigation is trying to figure out where a handset is because you don't know where the handset is, correct?
Well, I'm trying to include or exclude possible locations. So the question is, could the handset have been at Mr. Segura's residence? No. Could the handset have been at Ms. Peters' residence? Yes. So I'm including and excluding. I don't necessarily have to say exactly where it was. I'm not trying to say, exactly where the handset is. I can't do that. But I can include and exclude various locations that may or may not be relevant to the case.
And so what we would expect to see then is that the phone, when it's communicating with Tower 847 Sector 1, the phone is going to be within a, what would it be, 1.2 mile arc, plus or minus 0.64. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, if you take the worst that I saw, then yes, it would be plus or minus, or that whole range would be 1.2 miles.
Okay. And then for Tower 849, the maximum error range there was 1.25 miles, correct?
That is correct, for the absolute worst that we saw.
And again, that's the sector facing the victim's home, right?
That's correct.
All right. And so that's plus or minus, same as we discussed with the 0.64 figure. So you would expect the handset, when it's communicating with that particular sector of Tower 849, to be within a 2.5 mile arc.
Correct.
Okay. And the locations that I mentioned before, the defendant's sister's home and the church parking lot, those are both within both of those arcs, correct?
They would likely be, yes.
I want to ask you, Mr. Fuchs kind of touched on it, some anomalous or flyer type readings that you got, even within the small data sample from the defendant's actual communications from the 408 number on the 19th, starting at, well, I guess let's start at 6:01 first. 6:01 p.m., 18:01:54. You see that communication on the 19th?
Yes, sir.
The reported distance there is 3.98 miles from Tower 851, Sector 1, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Where is that location relative to the victim's house?
Well, I can bring it up on a map if that would be easier to show.
That would be fine, or if you know the actual distance, that would be fine too.
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head the distance
Okay.
from that to the victim's residence. Make sure I have the right one going here.
You gonna be a while, Mr. Prince? We probably do to take a short break if you can do that.
We can take a short break. Yes,
All
sir.
right, let's take 10 minutes.
The passive versus active. We talked before about whether someone is actually pushing buttons on the phone and making something happen or not. And that being a little bit of a clue to us whether, the handset is being used or not. So we look at those events and look at them as whether they are active or passive.
Okay. And it looks like, and this is the night of the homicide, what we do the night of the homicide, correct?
That is correct.
Right. And by looking at this information, it appears that you have a couple at the top here that are both active and passive events, with the last passive event being, or active event, being at 6:53 p.m.
That's correct.
Okay. The next one appears to be at 6:50, actually, it looks like there's two of them at 6:55.
Yes, and these are, again, the notifications. It would be a text message, and with that short code there, it would indicate to us just a notification sent from the carrier to the handset. Most often, that's like voicemail notification.
Okay. And those appear to be a passive event, so indicating that she's not doing anything with them, correct?
That is correct.
All right. And then again, we have another one at 7:13.
Correct.
Still passive?
It is passive. The direction tells us that it's routed, and actually we see in front of the number here, we see a 11. And if we go to Sprint's records key, it tells us that calls routed straight to voicemail will have a 11 before the number. So when we see that 11 here with these calls, and these will be text message notifications again, but for all the voice calls, we start seeing the 11, 11, 11, and again, Sprint tells us that means they were routed straight to voicemail.
Okay.
And I don't mean that someone had to push the button to send it to voicemail. I'm saying the network sent the phone straight to voicemail.
Okay, so that's the network doing that, not necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, it can be either one, but for this case, it does not require someone to actually hit ignore, and not take the phone call. The network is going to either try to reach the phone and not be able to do it, or once the phone leaves the network and the network knows that the phone's unreachable, then it'll go straight to voicemail. If you called someone and their phone is on and it rings and rings and rings and it finally goes to voicemail, versus if you call them and immediately goes to voicemail, the network knows the phone's not available.
Okay. So as it appears from this, that starting at 6:53 event, the following 6:53 event, from henceforth, there are no more active communications, meaning nobody was manipulating that phone with the speeder's phone, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and that's from that 6:53 p.m. all the way until the bodies were discovered?
That is correct. Of
Be seated. You can proceed, Mr. Prince.
Investigator Corbett, we were talking about the 6:01 p.m. communication from the 19th, and I had asked you about the reported distance from tower. It was tower 851, sector 1. It was a distance of 3.98 miles. I wanted to know how far that reported location was from the victim's home.
And that is approximately 1.48 miles.
Okay. Do you recall what the maximum error range was for tower 851?
For 851, that is 1.61 miles.
1.61 miles. Okay, so that's still consistent with, at least within that broad error range, that's still consistent with the victim's location, the victim's home location, correct?
It could still include the victim's residence. Certainly, if you take the maximum error that we saw in our test for that tower, it is less than that. So it could include her house, or it could be that you left for a period of time and went back. I don't know exactly the sequence of events.
If we were to assume that the handset is still at that location, that would certainly corroborate the idea that the error range is and can be up to the maximum that you have discussed, correct?
Well, we know it certainly can be up to the maximum versus what we usually see, but yes, that is a possibility.
Then by 6:05, we have the handset, the 408 handset, 6:05 on the 19th, in case it's not clear. We have the defendant's 408 phone back at a location consistent with the victim's home, correct?
That is correct.
He's again communicating with Tower 847 at that point, right?
That is correct.
Okay. So from in that 4-minute or less interval there, if the phone had been away, it's a mile back north again, right?
Yeah, and I can actually, I don't know if we're still hooked up, I can project this if it'd be easier to see. I do have the maps. And I'm sorry, your question?
I was just wanting to confirm that the handset within that 4-minute span is again reporting at a location consistent with her home by 6:05.
It is, yes.
Okay. And then if we could, let's jump to the 7:23, those two communications that are back-to-back 7 seconds apart, at 7:23:42 and 7:23:49. Let's jump to those two and talk about those. How far away are those reported distances from each other? And I know that takes a few steps of analysis because they're talking to different towers, but how far away are those reported distances with respect to their individual towers from each other?
Well, as they're two different towers, two different distances, that goes from they're exactly together to a maximum of And as we can see here, so what I have up now is, this is sort of the wizard behind the curtain. This is the map, the GIS mapping that was the basis of the presentation that I was doing earlier. So here I can turn on and off certain features, and this gives me the benefit of a measuring tool, which allows me to answer the questions a little quicker here. So these are the two distancing events that are being asked about. And as they are, again, two different distances, they could either be together here, where the distance between them is 0, or if you go to this point, then the maximum distance between them in miles, and I'm hoping I'm hitting the maximum part of the arc here, is just under 1 mile, would be the maximum that they are apart.
If we're to assume that the phone is at the victim's house here, how far apart are the readings if you draw a line straight through the victim's home?
If I were to look at the victim's home and go the distances here, then this one would be 4/10 of a mile, 4.47 miles would be that distance. And then if I were to look at the other distance, it would be 0.22 miles.
Okay, so a little over 6/10 of a mile. Am I calculating that right? One of them was 4/10 of a mile, or 4.47 miles?
Sure. I mean, I have to look at, it's not necessarily a straight line. You're saying how far is one from the other. So I have to go from the victim's residence to the closest point of that arc for both of them. So for one, that means I'm going, this direction, if you can follow the arrow, and for one, I'm going this direction. So it's not necessarily a straight line, but yes, probably about 6/10 of a mile.
Okay. Erring on the side of caution, that means that if he were actually traveling as opposed to in a single location, he would be traveling at some absurd speed, correct?
It'd be pretty quick, yes.
Yes. Okay. In 7 seconds going over half a mile. That's essentially what we would have to find there. Or the other more reasonable interpretation would be that we're working with larger error ranges here. Would that be correct?
Larger than which? I mean, we already knew that our maximum for this tower was 6/10 of a mile, just for this closest tower. So 6/10 of a mile would cover the 6/10 of a mile that we're discussing. Our error rate for the other tower that's south is 1.25 miles, so that would certainly cover that. So if you assume that this event has the worst possible error, they could be a lot further away, but if you assume these events have about the average error that we saw, then they're still consistent with the residents.
I should have asked you before, what was the average error that you worked out for Tower 847 and then 849 not using the flyers?
I don't have one without flyers.
You only calculated the average with the flyers?
Per tower, yes, that's correct.
Okay. What then is the average? We've talked about the maximum. What is the average for 847 and then 849?
So we really didn't do our test phone to come up with an error range. We just wanted to say, hey, what does our stuff look like versus the other stuff? Do they look the same? But of course, it does give us the ability to do that, to come up with an error range. And we looked at the data in a variety of different ways. And I could look at what was my error at a particular location. I could look what was my error for a particular data type. If it was a text message, a voice call, was it different? But what seemed to be the most accurate was to look at the error based on the cell sites. Because as I was communicating with cell sites further away, I would see a little greater errors, closer ones a little less. So that proved to me to be a more accurate representation. So the maximum, as you asked for, Tower 847 is 0.63. You can see that my average is just under 0.2 of a mile. So 0.195 is the average that we saw, and we can talk about those in meters as well. And 849, which is the 1.25, and my average is just over 1/4 of a mile for that tower.
Okay. It's true, though, isn't it, that within the 10 communications that take place for the 408 number between 6:01 p.m. and the second 7:23 p.m. communication, and that's all communications I'm talking about, calls, texts, and data, as indicated in your summary, 3 of those are well outside those error ranges. You've already told, I'll stop there and let you answer that and then ask the next one.
Okay, and again, go back to which event you're talking about?
The 6:01, which you said was about a mile. If we were to assume that the 408 handset is at her house at 6:01 p.m.,
Okay,
it was indicating it was a mile south of her house.
that's correct.
That would be within the maximum, but far outside the average for Tower 851, correct?
That's correct, but again, we're talking about that tower that's all the way down here in the south end of the county, and it is the tower that, consistently showed us more inaccuracy than the others. So for that one event, yes, it is, on the larger side of the error range, but it still could include the house.
Mm-hmm. And then for the other two communications I was referring to within an hour and a half, one of those communications was with tower 847, right?
Yes, now you're moving to the 723 events?
Right.
Okay.
One of is it the first one that's with 847?
The first one, the one that's at 723.42 is communicating with 847.
And that one's the one that's north of her house, about 0.47 miles, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Again, the error range for tower 847 that you averaged was what?
0.6 of a mile.
Okay. That was the maximum, right?
That is, I'm sorry, yes, the maximum is 0.6. My average for 847 is about 0.2.
Okay. So if we assume with respect to that communication, the communication that takes place at 7:23 and 42 seconds, that one is also more than double your average error rate, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then for the next communication, the one that takes place at 7:23 and 49 seconds, that's the one that lands south of the victim's house, correct? On this map that you have up right here?
That is correct.
All right. And what did you say that distance was, about 0.2?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, which is about what your average was, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So out of the 10 communications between 6:01 and 7:23 sequentially, well, I guess there's 9 if we do it to the first 7:23 communication, 2 of those 9 are way outside the average error range, correct? If we assume the handset is at her house.
If you assume that the handset is outside of the house, and since we're talking about all these distances, let me go ahead and get them onto the map here. So there is our data, and I believe that I have them all. 601, 605. So we can see that there are a number of distances. And yes, we have one that's short, we have one that's long. And again, as we deal with this data, we realize that we may have one that's here or there. But if I look at the bulk of that data, if I look at the majority of it, it to me paints a more consistent picture.
Okay. I want to ask you also, I thought that I heard you say during your testimony with Mr. Fuchs that you interpreted some communication around 10 o'clock as being on the way home as opposed to being at the defendant's house. Did I hear you right about that?
I don't remember if I gave directionality to it, but there was an event that referenced being near the Publix.
Isn't it true that all of the communications after 9:30 p.m. from both phones are at a location consistent with the defendant's house?
For both phones after what time?
And when I say both phones, I'm talking about the 408 number and the 509 number.
The 509. So the we can actually see. So we have our 9:30 events here, and I have no idea if you guys can see this. Let me zoom in here a little bit. Just want to make sure everyone's clear. So we have the 9:30 event that we talked about earlier communicated with our Verizon 850 Sector 2. And so we knew that was there, and that's the one that we see that's very consistent with the house. As we continue later in the evening on the 19th, now we're up here, this is 10:18. So 10:18 we go over, and now we're communicating with Verizon 848. We have left our 850 that we usually see, and now we're communicating with 848.1, and then 848, 848, 848, 848, and then we drop back to the 850 at 10:45. So these events here in the middle, this one right here, this 848.1, that is the north side of that one sector. And I can actually, I'd have to go to another map to show you, but here is 848. And so that is Sector 1. And that sector would be inconsistent with Mr. Segura's residence. So I can't say that all of the events after 9:30 are consistent with the phone being at the house.
Okay. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
You recall taking a deposition in this case, right?
I do, some years ago.
And you were under oath at that deposition just as you are today?
Yes, sir.
you recall being asked, looking at your summary, you believe his handset is consistent with him being back at his house, was it 9:16, 9:30? A call comes through, and you say yes. You go on to say you're going to look at the records, and then continue your answer. And for reference, I'm sorry, I didn't mention, beginning on page 21, I'll let you get there, at line 23. Continuing your answer, yes, and then down at line 10. So somewhere in between 9:21 and 9:30, he would have returned. That was your answer, correct?
I'm sorry, I might have been a page off. You're on page
22 now.
22. Okay.
The answer ends down at line 11.
So you ask when he's still up at the victim's house, and I say, right, this is still consistent with that. I believe there's another look at the record to say for sure, but I believe that the last event that we had at the residence, the next event is 9:30, so somewhere between 8:21 and 9:30 he would have returned.
And when you say he would have returned, you're talking about to his home, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So if you're now saying that the communication with the 948, was it 948, 848?
848.
If you're saying that's not consistent with his house, that means, according to what you said under the deposition, your testimony today, he would have had to return home and then go back to Publix and then come back home again. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. At any rate, he's nowhere near the victim's house again after 9:30, correct?
No. The question asked of me in the depot was, did he return home around 9:30? And yes, as we see in the events here, we see this 21:30, 9:30. The phone is communicating with 850 Sector 2, which is consistent with his house. So yes, the answer is correct. He did return home at around 9:30. I was not asked the subsequent question of, did it ever leave again? But if we look in the records, we can see that at some point it's inconsistent with the house. And your question is correct. It is not near Ms. Peters' residence, but it has left the house again.
At no point that night, just to be totally clear, at no point that night, the night of the 19th, into the early morning hours of the 20th, did either one of Henry Segura's phones go back anywhere near Brandy's house, right?
We have no records that indicate the handsets went back. There are periods of inactivity where we have no idea where they are, but there's nothing that shows that those handsets went back to the scene.
And the 408 number remains active into the early morning hours of the 20th, right?
Yes, it does.
And he's communicating with women, including Natasha Hawthorne, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. That all indicates that handset is attended at his home, correct?
Well, as you can see here, we have an event at 11:53, and then our next event is 3:35 a.m. So you have 3.5 hours that I can't say where the handset is or not.
Okay. And what about the 509 number?
We'll have to get that one up. Let's see. So for the 509 number, we have a data session at 9:46. We have a data session at 12:25, and then nothing until 10:21. So really, for this handset, that window of nothing active on the handset to tell us for sure that someone was behind it wherever it was. This handset would appear to be at the house, but we have a pretty large window where there's no activity at all.
So as far as you can say, absolutely no evidence from the cell phone records that either handset leaves Mr. Segura's home after returning for the last time that night.
After returning for the last time, no, there's no evidence that it moved again.
All right. Now you did, we heard some communication, we heard some testimony about the communications between Mr. Segura's primary phone and his wife Malika's phone during your direct exam.
That's correct.
Okay. You did location information or obtained location information for Malika's handset as well, correct?
We did, yes.
And Malika's handset was never anywhere near the victim's house either, correct?
Certainly not that I recall, no.
Okay. I want to ask you just a few quick questions about the victim's phone activity. there were several calls from her phone starting at 5:51 p.m. on the 19th, and then again at 6:11 p.m. on the 19th. Those were longer calls, correct, in duration? Particularly the one at 6:11 was like a 40-some minute call, correct?
Yeah, I certainly want to make sure I answer correctly here. The 611 call was 2,500 seconds, whatever the math is, if you divide that by 60, would tell you how many minutes it was. And so yes, it ended at 8:52, so it would have been, by Sprint's math, about a 41-minute phone call.
Okay. And then lastly, you had an opportunity to review all of the records for Mr. Segura's 408 phone, correct?
Yes.
So you reviewed not just the RTT data, which is the distance from tower data, but the text records, call records, all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Okay. Would it be fair to say that in viewing the text records in particular, it is apparent that many of Mr. Segura's communications are with different handsets, with different numbers, and many of those communications are about setting up sexual encounters or about sexual topics?
Certainly a portion of them include that, yes.
Thank you. I have no further questions at this time.
Redirect.
Last question. Other females, not Ms. Peters.
Correct.
That last phone call you just talked about on the 19th, you said something, I think you said it was on November 19th and it ended at 8:42. Is that what you?
Well, I hope not. 1842, which would have been 642.
1842, okay.
Yes.
Then I misunderstood you. Okay, I thought you said 8:42, my bad. So that's 6:42.
Yeah, it ended at 1852, which would have been 642.
Okay.
The military time.
All right, and then we have the subsequent text at 6:53,
That is correct.
and then nothing from there on.
That is correct.
Okay. Mr. Prince asked you a couple of questions about I think it was the sister, the two family members that were within Sector 1. Again, the data obtained from the test phone that you utilized and the data that was analyzed for the 408 number, there's nothing consistent there that would show that he was at either one of those locations, correct?
There's not. Looking at the bulk of the data, again, all those locations we saw, our distancing came up short of Tram Road. We can see for these here, they're beyond. So it's more consistent with being at Ms. Peters' residence than it is on any of the others that we looked at.
And you said the bulk of the transmissions. Is it important when you're looking at all this to look at the bulk and not just one particular event?
Yes, I believe it is.
And that is why you made so many events with the TPD phone and, of course, looked at all these analyses.
That's correct.
Okay. As it relates to Ms. Peters, you look at all her data for a period of time, correct?
Yes, we did.
Is it unusual, or would it appear to be unusual for Ms. Peters not to be utilizing her phone?
I didn't look at particular for periods of inactivity. What I have right here in my hand are records from November 13th through November 20th, so this is a 7-day period, and there's 26 pages of records. So I would say yes, she's consistently active on her phone.
When you look at those records and you look at hourly, just for instance, does it appear that there are multiple different things happening each hour, as in not like solitary phone call? You understand what I'm asking?
Yes, there's a significant number of text messages, voice calls, and again, I haven't looked at every period of inactivity, but in just this week, there's a good bit of activity on the handset.
Okay. So looking at that, just kind of overview, it appears that a longer period of inactivity, such as we saw on the 19th, is not a common occurrence from this.
It would seem to be unusual, yes.
No further questions.
All right, jury have a question of this witness. We'll go sidebar. Ms. Peters, you remain under oath.
Yes.
Have a seat. Slide up the microphone, please.
Thanks for joining us again, Ms. Peters. You told us yesterday that you're Brandy Peters' sister,
Yes, ma'am.
and you live here in Tallahassee, right?
Yes.
Who is Mary Rashad Williams?
My mama.
And is she also Brandy Peters' mom?
Yes, ma'am.
And does she live here in Tallahassee too?
Yes, she does.
Before Ms. Peters passed away, did the three of y'all, your mom, you, and Brandy Peters, did y'all see each other or talk on a daily basis?
Yes.
Who is Keyshandra Williams?
That's my niece.
And is she Brandy Peters? She'd be Brandy Peters' niece as well?
Yes.
And how old was Keyshandra Williams in 2010?
She had to be around 4 years old.
Okay. And she lived in Tallahassee?
Yes.
That's all. Thank you.
Any cross?
No, Your
All right. Call your next witness.
All right, this time David Rush.
Okay. All right, let's go sidebar for a moment, please. All right, as I told you, I have some legal issues that I need to resolve. If y'all want to sit back in the jury room for a couple hours, you can do so. But we thought maybe you'd rather go home than do that. So we're going to break with y'all till tomorrow morning. Tomorrow we're going to start at 9 o'clock. Please, let's everybody be here by 9 o'clock, please, so we can get started promptly. Don't discuss the case with anyone. Let anyone discuss the case with you or review any media accounts. Anybody have any issues we need to deal with, questions? If not, we'll see y'all tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. So what I want to do is resume at 1 o'clock with our motion hearings, just to give you all a heads up. I want to resolve the Santos issues first. Those are ones I'm most familiar with, and so let's keep them separate, because I think it can get confusing. We start mixing them together. So let's start with Santos at 1 o'clock. Get that out of the way. Yes, Mr. Fuchs?
Your Honor, as it relates to Mr. Hudson, if he is required to be, as far as testimony goes, he had, because of the short notice, he had multiple different patients that were coming in. He said he can make himself available to the court between 2:15 and 3 o'clock via phone, but he's unable to be here in person.
I was not intending to have Dr. Hudson. I may rely upon his reports. I don't see any reason to have him
Fair enough.
here in person. Does the defense think we need to have Mr. Hudson, Dr. Hudson here in person?
I don't think his testimony is relevant to the legal analysis, so I don't need to cross him.
Well, I mean, it may have some tangential, I mean, I think it might have some significance, but we've got reports from him. I'm not sure what his testimony would offer in addition to that. Do you have a different idea, Mr. Prince?
I don't think so, no, Your Honor.
Okay, I don't think we need to have him here. I may refer to his report, but I don't think we need to have him here. Anything else?
No, sir, that was the only scheduling.
All right, 1 o'clock, we'll be ready to do that.
Thank you.
All right.